Part I. Principles 1. Varieties of assesses. The original meaning of the term assesses, from sigma lambda omega, to train, was simply training, and, in a Roman sense, discipline. The corresponding Indo-Aryan term is tapas, tafao, tapon in play, and it has a like significance, except that, from the root tap, which means to be hot, or to glow, it also contains the idea of an intensive concentration, of glowing, almost of fire. With the development of Western civilization, however, the term assesses, or its derivatives, has, as we know, taken on a particular meaning that differs from the original. Not only has it assumed an exclusively religious sense, but from the general tone of the faith that has come to predominate among Western peoples, asceticism is bound up with ideas of mortification of the flesh and of painful renunciation of the world. It has thus come to represent the method that this faith usually advocates as the most suitable for gaining salvation and the reconciliation of man, weighed down by original sin, with his Creator. As early as the beginnings of Christianity, the name ascetic was applied to those who practiced mortification by flagellation of the body. Thus, with the growth of modern civilization, all that asceticism stood for gradually and inevitably became the object of strong dislike. If even Luther, with the resentment of one unable to understand or tolerate monastic disciplines, could refuse to recognize the necessity, value, and usefulness of any ascesis, and could substitute it by exaltation of pure faith, then humanism, immanency, and the new life cult were brought from their standpoint to heap discredit and scorn upon asceticism, broadly associating such tendencies with medieval obscurantism, and with the aberrations of historically outdated ages. And even when asceticism was not dismissed out of hand as pathological or as a kind of sublimated masochism, all sorts of incompatibilities to our ways of life were affirmed. The best known and most overworked of these is the antithesis supposed to exist between the ascetic, static, and emasculated, three-orient, renouncer and enemy of the world, and the dynamic, positive, heroic, and progressive Western civilization. Unfortunate prejudices such as these have succeeded in gaining a foothold in people's minds. Even Friedrich Nietzsche sometimes seriously believed that asceticism only attracted the pallid enemies of life, the weak and disinherited, and those who, in their hatred of themselves and the world, undermine with their ideas the civilizations created by a superior humanity. Furthermore, recent attempts have been made to provide climatic explanations of asceticism. Thus, according to Gunther, the Indo-Germans, under the influence of an enervating and unaccustomed climate in the Asiatic lands they had conquered, came slowly to regard the world as suffering, turning their energies away from a formation of life and toward a seeking for liberation by means of various ascetic disciplines. We need hardly discuss the low level to which asceticism has been brought by recent psychoanalytical interpretations. In the West, then, a tight net of misunderstanding and prejudice has been drawn round asceticism. The one-sided meaning given to asceticism by Christianity, through its frequent association therein with entirely misguided forms of spiritual life, has produced inevitable reactions. These have usually, and not without a certain anti-traditional and anti-religious bias, stressed only the negative side of what one kind of ascesis has to offer. The modern spirit, our own contemporaries, however, as though the position were inverted, are now again using expressions of this nature in the original sense, though adapting them to their own entirely materialistic plane. Thus we hear of a mystique of progress, a mystique of science, a mystique of labor, and so on, and likewise of an ascesis of sport, an ascesis of social service, and even of an ascesis of capitalism. In spite of the confusion of ideas, there is definitely to be found here a certain element of the original meaning of the word ascesis. This modern use of the word or its derivatives does, in fact, imply the simple idea of training, of intensive application of energy, not without a certain impersonality and neutralization of the purely individual and hedonistic element. Be that as it may, it is important at the present time that intelligent people should once again understand the value of asceticism in a comprehensive view of the universe, and thus what it may signify at successive spiritual levels, independently of the mere religious concepts of a Christian type as well as of the modern distinctions, for which they should refer to the fundamental traditions and the highest metaphysical concepts of the Aryan races. As we wished to discuss asceticism in this sense, we asked ourselves, what example can history furnish as the best suited for examination as a comprehensive and universal ascetic system that is clear and undiluted, well tried and well set out, in tune with the spirit of Aryan man and yet prevailing in the modern age? We eventually decided that the answer to our question could only be found in the Doctrine of Awakening, which, in its original form, satisfies all these conditions. The Doctrine of Awakening is the real signification of what is commonly known as Buddhism. The term Buddhism is derived from the Pali designation Buddha, Sanskrit Buddha, given to its founder. It is, however, not so much a name as a title. Buddha, from the root Bud, To awaken means the awakened one. It is thus the designation applied to one who attains the spiritual realization, likened to an arousing, or to an awakening, which Prince Siddhartha announced to the Indo-Aryan world. Buddhism, in its original form, the so-called Pali Buddhism, shows us, as do very few other doctrines, the characteristics we want. 1. It contains a complete ascetic system. 2. It is universally valid and it is realistic. 3. It is purely Aryan in spirit. 4. It is accessible in the general conditions of the historical cycle to which present-day humankind also belongs. We have implied that asceticism, when considered as a whole, can assume various meanings at successive spiritual levels. Simply defined, that is to say as training, or discipline, and ascesis aims at placing all the energies of the human being under the control of a central principle. In this respect we can, properly speaking, talk of a technique that has, in common with that of modern scientific achievements, the characteristics of objectivity and impersonality. Thus an eye, trained to distinguish the accessory from the essential, can easily recognize a constant, beyond the multiple variety of ascetic forms adopted by this or that tradition. In the first place, we can consider as accessory all the particular religious conceptions, or the particular ethical interpretations with which, in very many cases, asceticism is associated. Beyond all this, however, it is possible to conceive of and to work out what we may call a pure ascesis, that is to say, one made up of techniques for developing an interior force, the use of which, to begin with, remains undetermined, like the use of the arms and machines produced by modern industrial techniques. Thus, while ascetic reinforcement of the personality is the foundation of every transcendental realization, whether in the form of one historical tradition or another, it can likewise be of great value on the level of the temporal aspirations and struggles that absorb practically all the energies of modern Western people. Furthermore, we could even conceive of an ascesis of evil, for the technical conditions, as we may call them, needed to achieve any positive success in the direction of the evil, are not different in kind from those needed, for example, to attain sainthood. Nietzsche himself, as we have already pointed out, partly shared the modern widespread prejudice against asceticism, when dealing with his Superman, and when formulating the will zur Macht, did he not take into account various disciplines and forms of self-control that are clearly of an ascetic nature? Thus, at least within certain limits, we can quote the words of an old medieval tradition: 1 the art, 1 the material, 1 the crucible. 5 principles. Now, few other great historical traditions allow us to isolate so easily the elements of a pure ascesis as does the doctrine of awakening, that is to say, Buddhism. It has been justly said of Buddhism that in it the ascetic problems have been stated and resolved so clearly, and one could almost say so logically, that, in comparison, other forms of mysticism seem incomplete, fragmentary and inconclusive, and that, far from being weighed down by every kind of emotional and sentimental element, an austere and objective style of intellectual clarity so much predominates that one is almost forced to compare it with the modern scientific mentality. In this respect 2 points must be emphasized. First, the Buddhist ascesis is conscious, in the sense that in many forms of asceticism, and in the case of Christian asceticism almost without exception, the accessory is inextricably tied up with the essential, and ascetic realizations are, one might say, indirect, because they result from impulses and workings of the mind determined by religious suggestions or raptures, while in Buddhism there is direct action, based on knowledge, conscious of its aim and developing throughout in controlled stages. Just as a practiced turner or turner's apprentice, when turning quickly, knows, I am turning quickly, and when turning slowly, knows, I am turning slowly, and, as a practiced butcher or butcher's apprentice who butchers a cow, takes it to the marketplace and dissects it piece by piece, he knows these parts, he looks at them and examines them well and then sits down. Here are 2 trenchant similes, chosen from many, and typical of the style of consciousness of every ascetic or contemplative procedure in the doctrine of awakening. Another image is furnished by clear and transparent water through which can be seen everything lying on the bottom, symbolical of a mind that has left behind all unrest and disturbance. 3. And it will be seen that this style persists throughout, on every level of Buddhist discipline. It has been well said that this path through consciousness and awakening is as clearly described as a road on an accurate map, along which every tree, every bridge and every house is marked. 4. Second, Buddhism is almost the only system that avoids confusion between asceticism and morality, and in which the purely instrumental value of the latter in the interests of the former is consciously realized. Every ethical precept is measured against an independent scale, that is, according to the positive, ascetic, effects that result from following these precepts or failing to follow them. From this it can be seen that not only have all religious mythologies been surpassed, but also all ethical. I. B. Jansilk, La Mística del Budismo, Turin, 1925. p. 304. To Majrimanikia, 10. 3 cf. e.g., Jtaka, 185. 4 E. Reinhardt. In the introduction to the works of K. E. Neumann, quoted by I. de Lorenzo, I. Discord di Budo, Bari 1925, Wall. 2, p. 15. 6 Mythologies. In Buddhism, the elements of self, that is, of right conduct, are considered purely as instruments of the mind. 5 It is not a question of values, but of instruments. Instruments of our virtues, not in the moralistic sense but in the ancient sense of virile energy. Here we have the well-known parable of the raft. A man, wishing to cross a dangerous river and having built a raft for this purpose, would indeed be a fool if, when he had crossed, he were to put the raft on his shoulders and take it with him on his journey. This must be the attitude Buddhism teaches to all that is labeled by ethical views as good or evil, just or unjust. 6. Thus we can fairly claim that in Buddhism, as also in yoga, asceticism is raised to the dignity and impersonality of a science. What is elsewhere fragmentary here becomes systematic, what is instinct becomes conscious technique, the spiritual labyrinth of those minds that achieve a real elevation through the workings of some grace, since it is only accidentally and by means of suggestions, fears, hopes, and raptures that they discover the right way, is replaced by a calm and uniform light, present even in abysmal depths, and by a method that has no need of external means. All this, however, refers only to the first aspect of asceticism, the most elementary in the ascetic hierarchy. When an ascesis is understood as a technique for the conscious creation of a force that can be applied, in the first place, at any level, then the disciplines taught by the doctrine of awakening can be recognized as those that incorporate the highest degree of crystallinity and independence. However, we encounter inside the system a distinction between the disciplines that suffice for this life, and those that are necessary to tuck even beyond. Ascetic achievement in Buddhism is exploited essentially in an upward direction. This is how the sense of such achievements is expressed in the canon, and he reaches the admirable path discovered by the intensity, the constancy and the concentration of the will, the admirable path discovered by the intensity, the constancy, and the concentration of the energy, the admirable path discovered by the intensity, the constancy and the concentration of the spirit, the admirable path discovered by the intensity, the constancy and the concentration of investigation, with a heroic spirit as the fifth. And this continues, and thus attaining these 15 heroic qualities, he is able, O disciples, to achieve liberation, to achieve awakening, to attain the incomparable sureness. 8 In this connection another text considers a double possibility, either certainty in life, or no return after death. 9 If, on the highest level, sureness is linked with the state of awakening, the alternatives can he similarly interpreted on a lower level, and we. 5 March, 53. 6 Ibid. 22. 7 cf. e.g., March, 53. 8 March, 16. 9 Ibid. 10. 7th may think of a more relative sureness in life, created by a preliminary group of ascetic disciplines and able to prove its value in all fields of life, and yet that is essentially a foundation for an ascesis of a higher nature. It is in this sense that we can talk of an intensive application, which is cons either to be the keystone of the whole system and which, when developed and constantly practiced, leads to twofold health, health in the present and health in the future. Sureness, in ascetic development, 1, is associated with unshakable calm, samantha, which may be considered as the highest aim of a neutral discipline, and which can be pursued by one who yet remains essentially a son of the world, patujana. Beyond this there is an unshakable calm, samantha, which is associated with knowledge, vipassan, and which then leads to liberation. Here we have, then, a new conception of the ascesis, on a higher plane than the last, and taking us to a level above normal perception and individual experience, and at the same time it becomes clear why Buddhism, on this higher level also, gives us positive points of reference such as we find in few other traditions. The fact is that Buddhism in its original form carefully avoids anything that savors of simple religion, of mysticism in its most generally accepted sense, of systems of faith, or devotion, or of dogmatic rigidity. And even when we consider that which is no longer of that life, that which is more than life, Buddhism, as the doctrine of awakening, offers us those very traits of severity and nudity that characterize the monumental, and features of clarity and strength, that may be called, in a general sense, classical, a virile and courageous attitude that would seem Promethean. Array it not indeed essentially Olympian, but before this can be appreciated, once again various prejudices must be removed, and here it is well to discuss 2 points. It has been claimed that Buddhism, in its essentials, and leaving out of account its later popular forms, entirely centered as they were on a deified concept of its founder, is not a religion. This is true. We must, however, be quite clear as to what we mean when we say this. The peoples of the West are so inured to the religion that has come to predominate in their countries that they consider it as a kind of unit of measure and as a model for every other religion. They are near denying the dignity of true religion to any concept of the supersensory and to man's relationship to it, when the concept in any way differs from the Judeo-Christian type. The result of this has been that the most ancient traditions of the West itself, beginning with the Aryo-Hellenic and the Aryo-Roman, are no longer understood in their real significance. 10 Anguttaranikya, 3.65, 1.15. Cf. Samyukta, 35.198, where the disciplines are stated to be valid for this life since, in it, they create self-possession, and yet build the firm foundations for the destruction of the aswa. That is, for the task of following the upward path. 2 in Angat. 4.170 it is said that the bonds give way and the path opens when Samanta is combined with Vipassana. 8 or effective value. 12 so it is easy to imagine what happened to older and often more remote traditions, particularly to those created by the Aryan races in Asia. But, indeed, this attitude should be reversed, and just as modern civilization is an anomaly when compared with what has always been true civilization, so the significance and the value of the Christian religion should be measured according to that part of its content that is consonant with a vaster, more Aryan, and more primordial concept of the supersensory. We need not dwell on this point since we have already dealt with it elsewhere. Dalke sums up the matter, saying that one characteristic of Western superficiality is the tendency always to identify religion as a whole with religion based on faith. 14 beyond. Those who believe are those who know, and to these the purely mythological character of many simply religious, devotional, and even scholastically theological concepts is quite clear. It is largely a question of different degrees of knowledge. Religion, from religo, is, as the word itself indicates, a reconnecting and, more specifically, a reconnecting of a creature to a creator with the eventual introduction of a mediator or of an expiator. On the basis of this central idea can be built up a whole system of faith, devotion, and even mysticism that, admittedly, is capable of carrying an individual to a certain level of spiritual realization. However, it does so to a large extent passively since it is based essentially in sentiment, emotion, and suggestion. In such a system no amount of scholastic explaining will ever completely resolve the irrational and subintellectual element. We can easily understand that in some cases such religious forms are necessary, and even the East, in later periods, has known something of the kind. For instance, the way of devotion, Bhaktimarga, from Bhaj to adore, of Ramanuja and certain forms of the Sakti cult, but we must also realize that there may be some who have no need of them and who, by race and by calling, desire a way free from religious mythologies, a way based on clear knowledge, realization, and awakening. An ascetic, whose energies are employed in this direction, achieves the highest form of ascesis, and Buddhism gives us an example of an ascesis that is outstanding of its kind. In saying, of its kind, we wish to point out that Buddhism represents a great historical tradition with texts and teachings available to all. It is not an esoteric school with its knowledge reserved for a restricted number of initiates. In this sense we can, and indeed we must, state that Buddhism, referring always to original Buddhism, is not a religion. This does not mean that it denies supernatural and metaphysical reality, but only that it has nothing to do with the way of 12 CFWF Otto, Die Getter Griechenlands, 1935, 1, 2, and Passim. 13 CF Arganon, Orient et Occident, Paris, 1924 La Crise du Monde Moderne, Paris. S. 1925. English translations, East and West, London 1941, and The Crisis of the Modern World, London, 1943. 14 P. Dalke, Buddhism as Religion and Moral, Munich and Neubiberg, 1923, p. 11. 9 Regarding one's relationship with this reality that we know more or less as religion. The validity of these statements would in no way be altered were one to set out in greater detail to defend the excellence of the theistic point of view against Buddhism, by charging the doctrine of awakening with more or less declared atheism. This brings us to the second point for discussion, but which we need only touch upon here as it is dealt with at length later in this work. We have admitted that a religiously conceived system can carry an individual to a certain level of spiritual realization. The fact that this system is based on a theistic concept determines this level. The theistic concept, however, is by no means either unique or even the highest religious relationship such as the Hindu bhakti or the predominant faiths in the Western or Arab world. Whatever one may think of it, the theistic concept represents an incomplete view of the world, since it lacks the extreme hierarchic apex. From a metaphysical and, in the higher sense, traditional point of view, the notion on which theism is based of representing being, in a personal form even when theologically sublimated, can never claim to be the ultimate ideal, the concept and the realization on of the extreme apex or, in other words, of that which is beyond both such a being and its opposite, non-being, was and is natural to the Aryan spirit. It does not deny the theistic point of view but recognizes it in its rightful hierarchic place and subordinates it to a truly transcendental concept. It is freely admitted that things are less simple than they seem in Western theology, especially in the realm of mysticism, and more particularly where it is concerned with so-called negative theology. Also in the West, the notion of a personal God occasionally merges into the idea of an ineffable essence, of an abysmal divinity, as the new conceived by the Neoplatonists beyond the new, as the Gottheit in the neuter beyond the God, which, after Dionysius the Areopagite, appeared frequently in German mysticism and which exactly corresponds with the neuter Brahman above the theistic Brahm of Hindu speculation. But in the West it is more a notion wrapped in a confused mystical cloud than a precise doctrinal and dogmatic definition conforming to a comprehensive cosmic system. And this notion, in point of fact, has had little or no effect on the religious bias prevalent in the Western mind. Its only result has been to carry a few men, confused in their occasional intuitions and visions, beyond the frontiers of orthodoxy. That very apex that Christian theology loses in a confused background is, instead, very often placed consciously in the foreground by the Aryo-Oriental traditions. To talk in this respect of atheism or even of pantheism betrays ignorance, and ignorance shared by those who spent their time unearthing oppositions and antitheses. The truth is that the traditions of the Aryans who settled in the East retain and conserve much of what the later traditions of races of the same root who settled in the West have lost or no longer understand or retain only fragmentarily. A contributing zero-ing factor here is the undoubted influence on European faiths of concepts of Semitic and Asiatic Mediterranean origin. Thus to accuse of atheism the older traditions, particularly the doctrine of awakening, and also other Western traditions that reflect the same spirit, only betrays an attempt to expose and discredit a higher point of view on the part of a lower one, an attempt that, had circumstances been reversed, would have been qualified out of hand by the religious West as satanic. And, in fact, we shall see that it was exactly thus that it appeared to the doctrine of the Buddha, CFP 85-86. The recognition of that which is beyond both being and non-being opens to ascetic realization possibilities unknown to the world of theism. The fact of reaching the apex, in which the distinction between creator and creature becomes metaphysical, meaningless, allows of a whole system of spiritual realizations that, since it leaves behind the categories of religious thought, is not easily understood, and, above all, it permits a direct ascent, that is, an ascent up the bare mountainside, without support and without useless excursions to one side or another. This is the exact meaning of the Buddhist ascesis. It is no longer a system of disciplines designed to generate strength, sureness, and unshakable calm, but a system of spiritual realization. Buddhism, and again later we shall see this distinctly, carries the will for the unconditioned to a limit that is almost beyond the imagination of the modern Westerner. And in this ascent beside the abyss the climber rejects all mythologies, he proceeds by means of pure strength, he ignores all mirages, he rids himself of any residual human weakness, he acts only according to pure knowledge. Thus the awakened one, Buddha, the victor, Jina, could be called he, whose way was unknown to men, angels, and to Brahma himself, the Sanskrit name for the theistic God. Admittedly, this path is not without dangers, yet it is the path open to the virile mind, Viryamaga. The texts clearly state that the doctrine is for the wise man, the expert, not for the ignorant, the inexpert. 15. The simile of the cutting grass is used, as coarser grass when wrongly grasped cuts the hand, so the ascetic life wrongly practiced leads to infernal torments. The simile of the serpent is used, as a man who wants serpents goes out for serpents, looks for serpents, and finding a powerful serpent, grasps it by the body or by the tail, and the serpent striking at him bites his hand or arm, or other part so that he suffers death or mortal anguish. And why is this? Because he wrongly grasped the serpent, so there are men who are harmed by the doctrines. And why is this? Because they wrongly grasped the doctrines. It must be thus quite clear that the doctrine of awakening is not itself 1.15. March 2. 16 Dhammapada, 311. 17 March 22. 11. Particular religion that is opposed to other religions. Even in the world in which it grew, it respected the various divinities and the popular cults of religious type that were attached to them. It understood the value of works. Virtuous and devout men go to heaven, but a different path is taken by the awakened ones. They go beyond as a fire which, little by little, consumes every bond, both human and divine. And it is fundamentally an innate attribute of the Aryan soul that causes us never to meet in the Buddhist texts any sign of departure from consciousness, of sentimentalism or devout effusion, or of semi-intimate conversation with a god, although throughout there is a sense of strength, inexorably directed toward the unconditioned. We have now elaborated the first three reasons why Buddhism in particular is so suitable as a base for an exposition of a complete ascesis. Summing up, the first is the possibility of extracting easily from Buddhism the elements of an ascesis considered as an objective technique for the achievement of calm, strength, and detached superiority, capable in themselves of being used in all directions. The second is that in Buddhism the ascesis has also the superior signification of a path of spiritual realization quite free from any mythology, whether religious, theological, or ethical. The third reason, finally, is that the last stretch of such a path corresponds to the supreme in a truly metaphysical concept of the universe, to a real transcendency well beyond the purely theistic concept. Thus, while the Buddha considers the tendency to dogmatize as a bond, and opposes the empty sufficiency of those who proclaim, only this is truth, foolishness is the rest, 20 yet he maintains firmly the knowledge of his own dignity. Perhaps you may wish, disciples, thus knowing, thus understanding, to return for your salvation to the rites and the fantasies of the ordinary penitent or priest. No, indeed, is the answer. Is it thus then, disciples, that you speak only of that on which you yourselves have meditated, which you yourselves have known, which you yourselves have understood? Even so, Master. This is well, disciples. Remain, then, endowed with this doctrine, which is visible in this life, timeless, inviting, leading onward, intelligible to all intelligent men. If this has been said, for this reason has it been said. 21 And again, there are penitents and priests who exalt liberation. They speak in various manners glorifying liberation. But as for that which concerns the most noble, the highest liberation, I know that none equals me, let alone that first may he surpassed. 22 This has been called, in the tradition, the lion's roar. 18 Dhammapta, 126. 19 Ibid, 31. 20 cf, e.g., Sattanipata, 4.12, 13.17, 19. 21 March, 38. 22 Vatanikya, 8.21, 12.2. The ironness of the doctrine of awakening. We have yet to say something of the irony of the Buddhist doctrine. Our use of the term iron in connection with this doctrine is primarily justified by direct reference to the texts. The term Arya, skt. Which in fact means iron, recurs throughout the canon. The path of awakening is called iron, Aryamaga. The four fundamental truths are iron Aryasakni. The mode of knowledge is iron, Aryanaya. The teaching is called iron, particularly that which considers the contingency of the world, and is, in turn, addressed to the Re. The doctrine is spoken of as accessible and intelligible, not to the common crowd, but only to the Arya. The term Arya has sometimes been translated as saint. This, however, is an incomplete translation. It is even discordant when we consider the notable divergence between what is concerned and all that saint lines means to a Western man. Nor is the translation of Arya as noble or sublime any more satisfactory. They are all later meanings of the word, and they do not convey the fullness of the original nor the spiritual, aristocratic, and racial significance that, nevertheless, is largely preserved in Buddhism. This is why Orientalists, such as R.H.Y.S. Davids and Woodward, have maintained that it is better not to translate the term at all, and they have left Arya wherever it occurs in the texts, either as an adjective or as a noun meaning a certain class of individuals. In the texts of the canon the Arya are the awakened ones, those who have achieved liberation and those who are united to them. Since they understand, accept, and follow the Arya doctrine of awakening, it is necessary, however, that we should emphasize the ironness of the Buddhist doctrine for various reasons. In the first place, we must anticipate those who 1 cf. Sanyutta 35,84, 42.12. 2. The racial significance of the term Arya is clear in certain texts, e.g., where it is considered as a difficult birth to achieve and where it is a privilege to be born in the land of the Aryans. Anguttara 6.96. 13 Principles will put forward the argument of Asiatic exclusiveness, saying that Buddhism is remote from our traditions and our races. We have to remember that behind the various caprices of modern historical theories, and as a more profound and primordial reality, there stands the unity of blood and spirit of the white races who created the greatest civilizations both of the East and West, the Iranian and Hindu as well as the ancient Greek and Roman and the Germanic. Buddhism has the right to call itself Aryan both because it reflects in great measure the spirit of common origins and since it has preserved important parts of a heritage that, as we have already said, Western man has little by little forgotten, not only by reason of involved processes of intermarriage, but also since he himself, to a far greater extent than the Eastern Aryans, has come under foreign influences, particularly in the religious field. As we have pointed out, Buddhist asceticism, when certain supplementary elements have been removed, is truly classical in its clarity, realism, precision, and firm and articulate structure. We may say it reflects the noblest style of the ancient Aryo-Mediterranean world. Furthermore, it is not only a question of form. The ascesis proclaimed by Prince Siddhartha is suffused throughout with an intimate congeniality and with an accentuation of the intellectual and Olympian element that is the mark of Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Roman Stoicism. Other points of contact are to be found where Christianity has been rectified by a transfusion of iron blood that had remained comparatively pure, that is to say, in what we know as German mysticism. There is Meister Eckhart's sermon on detachment, on Abgeschiedenheit, and his theory of the noble mind, and we must not forget Totter and Celsius, to insist here, as in every other field of thought, on the antithesis between East and West is pure dilettantism. The real contrast exists in the first place between concepts of a modern kind and those of a traditional kind, whether the latter are Eastern or Western, and secondly, between the real creations of the iron spirit and blood and those which, in East and West alike, have resulted from the admixture of non-iron influences. As Dalke has justly said, among the principal ways of thought, in ancient times, Buddhism can best claim to be of pure iron origin. This is true also more specifically, although we can apply the term iron as a generalization to the mass of Indo-European races as regards their common origin. The original homeland of such races, the Aryan much, according to the memory consciously preserved in the ancient Iranian tradition, was a Hyperborean region or, more generally, northwestern, yet, later, it became a designation of caste. Rie. 3 P. Dalke, Buddhismus as Weltanschauung, Munich and Neubiberg, undated. p. 35. English translation. Buddhism and Science, London T. 913. p. 29. 4 In this connection CFR works, Rivolta contra il mondo modem degree, Milan, 1934. English translation, Revolt against the modern world, Rochester. VT. 1995, Synthesi. Die Doctrine del Fraser, Milan, T. 941. 14 The ironness of the doctrine of awakening stood essentially for an aristocracy opposed, both in mind and body, not only to obscure, bastard, demoniacal, races among which must be included the Koslian and Dravidian strains found by the Hyperboreans in the Asiatic lands they conquered, but also, more generally, to that substratum that corresponds to what we would probably call today the proletarian and plebeian masses born in the normal way to serve, and that in India as in Rome were excluded from the bright cults characteristic of the higher patrician, warrior, and priestly castes. Buddhism can claim to be called iron in this more particular social sense also, notwithstanding the attitude, of which we shall have more to say later, that it adopted toward the castes of those times. The man who was later known as the Awakened One, is, the Buddha, was the Prince Siddhartha. According to some, he was the son of a king, according to others, at least of the most ancient warrior nobility of the Skya race, proverbial for its pride. There was a saying, proud as a Skya. 5 This race claimed descent, like the most illustrious and ancient Hindu dynasties, from the so-called solar race, Sriyavamsa, and from the very ancient king Ikavku. 6 He, of the solar race, one reads of the Buddha. He says so himself, I am descended from the solar dynasty and I was born a Skya. 8 And by becoming an ascetic who has renounced the world he vindicates his royal dignity, the dignity of an Iron King. Tradition has it that his person appeared as a form adorned with all the signs of beauty and surrounded by a radiant aureole. 10 To a sovereign who meets him and does not know who he is, he immediately gives the impression of an equal. Thou hast a perfect body, thou art resplendent, well-born, of noble aspect, thou hast a golden color and white teeth, thou art strong. All the signs that thou art of noble way of heart. In thy form, all the marks of a superior man. 11 The most fearsome bandit, meeting him, asks himself in amazement who might be this ascetic who comes alone with no companion. Like a 5-page Olden-Beard, Buddha, Stuttgart and Beritin 1923. p. 1. Prince Siddhartha seems to retain his pride even when he is the Buddha uttering such words as these, in the world of angels, of demons and of gods, among the ranks of ascetics and of priests, I do not see, O Brahman, anyone whom I shout respect feudity salute nor before whom I should rise for him row be seated. Anguttara Nikaya. 8.111. 6 Satyanikta. 3 June 1931 It is worth noting that Ikavku was conceived as Rh son of Manu, that is, of the primordial legislator of the Indo-Aryan races, and that these references in Buddhism are significant. In fact, the same royal and solar origin is attributed to the doctrine expounded in the Bhagavad 4.1-2, a doctrine that was revealed after a period of Octavian to a Kshatriya, that is, to an exponent of warrior nobility, and that shows us how the path of detachment can also produce an unconditioned and irresistible form of heroism. Cf. Revolt against the modern world. 7 Samyukta, 22.95. 8 Satyanikta, 3.1.T9. 9 Ibid, 3 July 2007. 10 Jtaka, I11. Satyanip. Ta, 3.7.1, 2, 5-6. 15 Principles. Conqueror. And not only do we find in his body and hearing the characteristics of a Katya, of a noble warrior of high lineage, but tradition has it that he was endowed with the 32 attributes that according to an ancient Brahmanical doctrine were the mark of the superior man. Lakana, for whom exist only TW possibilities, without a third, either to remain in the world and to become a Kakavati, that is, a king of kings, a universal sovereign, the iron prototype of the Lord of the earth, or else to renounce the world and to become perfectly awakened, the Sambuddha, one who has removed the veil. Legend tells us that in a prophetic vision of a whirling wheel an imperial destiny was foretold for Prince Siddhartha, a destiny that, however, he rejected in favor of the other path. 14. It is equally significant that, according to tradition, the Buddha directed that his funeral rite should not be that of an ascetic, but of an imperial sovereign, a Kakavati. 1. 5. In spite of the attitude of Buddhism towards the caste problem, it was generally held that the Bodhisattva, those who may one day become awakened, are never born into a peasant or servile caste but into a warrior or Brahman caste, that is to say, into the two purest and highest of the iron castes. Indeed, in the conditions then prevailing, the warrior caste, the Katya, was said to be the more favored. This iron nobility and this warrior spirit are reflected in the doctrine of awakening itself. Analogies between the Buddhist ascesis and war, between the qualities of an ascetic and the virtues of a warrior and of a hero recur frequently in the canonical texts. A struggling ascetic with fighting breast, an advance with a fighter's steps, hero, victor of the battle, supreme TR, triumph of the battle, favorable conditions for the combat, qualifies of a warrior becoming to a king, well worthy of a king, attributes of a king, etc. And in such maxims as, to die in battle is better than to live defeated. As for nobility, it is bound up here with aspiration towards superhumanly inspired liberty. As a bull, I have broken every bond, says Prince Siddhartha. 19. Having laid aside the burden, he has destroyed the bonds of existence. This is a theme that continually recurs in the texts, and refers to one who follows the path they indicate. As summits hard to climb, like solitary lions, the enlightened are described. 2. Degree the awakened one is a proud saint who has climbed 12 Majib, 86. 13 Satyanipta, 3.s, 5.1.25, 28, March, 91, Daga, 3.15, etc. Satyanipta, 3. 16, 19. A Rishite detailed, not without interest, is thar among the distinguishing marks included a dark blue color of the eyes. 14 Shtaka, in W64. 15, Diga. 16th May 2011, 17th January 2008. 16 Shtaka, in W40, for I. 7, CF March, 53, 26, Angat. 4.151, 196, 5.90. 73 FF. 18, Satyanipta, 3rd February 2016. 9 Ibid, 1st February 2012. 20 March. 92, Satyanipta. 3rd July 1925. 16 The most sublime mountain peaks, who has penetrated the remotest forests, who has descended into profound abysses. 21 He himself said, I serve no man, I'll have no need to serve any man. 22 An idea that recalls the autonomous and immaterial race, the race without a king, alpha beta alpha sigma lambda epsilon nu tau omicron, being itself kingly, a race that is also mentioned in the West. 23 He is ascetic, pure, the knower, free, sovereign. 24 These, which are frequent even in the oldest texts, are some of the attributes, not only of the Buddha, but also of those who travel along the same path. The natural exaggeration of some of these attributes does not alter their significance, at least as symbols and indications of the nature of the path and ideal indicated by Prince Siddhartha, and of his spiritual race. The Buddha is an outstanding example of a royal ascetic. His natural counterpart in dignity is a sovereign who, like a Caesar, could claim that his race comprehended the majesty of kings as well as the sacredness of the gods who hold even the rulers of men in their power too. We have seen that the ancient tradition has this precise significance when it speaks of the essential nature of individuals who can only be either imperial or perfectly awakened. We are close to the summits of the iron spiritual world. A particular characteristic of the ironness of the original Buddhist teaching is the absence of those proselytizing manias that exist, almost without exception, in the direct proportion to the plebeian and anti-aristocratic character of a belief. An iron mind has too much respect for other people, and its sense of its own dignity is too pronounced to allow it to impose its own ideas upon others, even when it knows that its ideas are correct. Accordingly, in the original cycle of iron civilizations, both Eastern and Western, there is not the smallest trace of divine figures being so concerned with mankind as to come near to pursuing them in order to gain their adherence and to save them. The so-called salvationist religions, the Erlösungsreligionen, in German, make their appearance both in Europe and Asia at a later date, together with a lessening of the preceding spiritual tension, with a fall from Olympian consciousness and, not least, with influxes of inferior ethnic and social elements. That the divinities can do little for men, that man is fundamentally the artificer of his own destiny, even of his development beyond this world. This characteristic view held by original Buddhism demonstrates its difference from some later forms, especially of the Mahayana schools, into which infiltrated the idea of a 21 March 50, 22 Satanipta, 1st February 2008, 23 Zosimus, text in Berthelot, Collection des Alchimistes Greci, Paris 1887, Wall 2p 213, 24 March 39, 25 Suetonius, De Vitatis Room 6. The equivalence of the two types is indicated, for example, by Angle 13, 2.44, where it is said that two beings appear in the world fought, the height of many, for the good of gods and men, the perfect awakened one and the Kakavati or universal sovereign. 17 Power from on high busying itself with mankind in order to lead each individual to salvation. In point of method and teaching, in the original TE.XTS we see that the Buddha expounds the truth as he has discovered it, without imposing himself on anyone and without employing outside means to persuade or convert. He who has eyes will see, is a much repeated saying of the texts. Let an intelligent man come to me, we read 26, a man without a tortuous mind, without hypocrisy, an upright man, I will instruct him, I will expound the doctrine. If he follows the instruction, after a short while he himself will recognize, he himself will see, that thus indeed one liberates oneself from the bonds, that is, of ignorance. Here follows a simile of an infant freeing itself gradually from its early limitations. This image exactly corresponds to the Platonic simile of the expert midwife and the art of aiding births. Again, I will not force you, as the potter his raw clay. By reproving I will instruct, and by urging you, he who is sound will endure. 27. Besides, the original intention of Prince Siddhartha was, having once achieved his knowledge of truth, to communicate it to no one, not from ill-mindedness, but because he realized its profundity and foresaw that few would understand it. Having then recognized the existence of a few individuals of a nobler nature with clearer vision, he expounded the doctrine out of compassion, maintaining, however, his distance, his detachment, and his dignity. Whether disciples come to him or not, whether or not they follow his ascetic precepts, always he remains the same. 28 This is his manner. No persuasion and no dissuasion, knowing persuasion and knowing dissuasion, do not persuade and do not dissuade, expound only reality. 29 It is wonderful, says another text. 30 It is astonishing that no one exalts his own teaching and no one despises the teaching of another in an order where there are so many guides to show the doctrine. This, too, is typically iron. It is true that the spiritual power that the Buddha possessed could not but show itself sometimes almost automatically, demanding immediate recognition. We read, for example, of the incident described as the first footprint of the elephant, where wise men and expert dialecticians wait for Buddha at a ford seeking an opportunity to defeat him with their arguments, but when they see him, they ask only to hear the doctrine, or of another where, when the Buddha enters a discussion, his words destroy all opposition, like a furious elephant or a blazing fire. 32. There is the account of his former companions who, B26, March, 80, 27 Ibid, 122, 28 Ibid, 49, 137, 29 Ibid, I39, 30 Ibid, 76, I Ibid, 27, 32 Ibid, 35. L8 leaving him to have left the road of asceticism, propose among themselves not to greet him, but who when immediately they see him go to meet him, and there is the story of the fierce bandit Angulimala who is awed by the Buddha's majestic figure. In any case, it is certain that the Buddha, in his Aryan superiority, always abstained from using indirect methods of persuasion and, in particular, never used any that appealed to the irrational, sentimental, or emotional element in a human being. This rule too is definite: you must not, 0 disciples, show to laymen the miracle of the supernormal powers. He who does this is guilty of an offense of wrongdoing. The individual is put on one side. In truth, the noble sons declare their higher knowledge in such a manner, that they state the truth, without any reference whatsoever to their own person. 1934, Why is this? Says the Buddha to one who has eagerly waited for a long time to see him, he who sees the law, sees me, and he who sees me sees the law. In truth, by seeing the law I am seen, and by seeing me the law is seen. 35 Being himself awakened, the Buddha wishes only to encourage an awakening in those who are capable of it, an awakening, in the first place, of a sense of dignity and of vocation, and in the second, of intellectual intuition. A man who is incapable of intuition, it is said, cannot approve. 36 The noble miracle, conforming to the iron nature, Ariadri, as opposed to prodigies based on extranormal phenomena, and considered to be non-iron, Anariadri, is concerned with this very point. The miracle of the teaching stirs the faculty of discernment and furnishes a new and accurate measure of all values. The most typical of the canonical expressions for this is the Re is this, he understands, there is the common and there is the excellent, and there is a higher escape beyond this perception of the senses. 1938. Here is a characteristic passage describing the awakening of intuition. His the disciple's heart suddenly feels pervaded with sacred enthusiasm, and his whole mind is revealed pure, clear, shining as the luminous disk of the moon, and the truth appears to him in its completeness. This is the foundation of the only faith, of the only right confidence, considered by the order of the ions, an active confidence, rooted in insight, firm, a confidence that no penitent or priest, no god or devil, no angel nor anyone else in the world can destroy. 41. Perhaps it is worth briefly discussing a final point. The fact that the Buddha, normally, does not appear in the play texts as a supernatural being descended to. 33 Vinya.2.112. 34 Angat, 6.49. 35 Samyat, 22.87. 36 March, 95. 37 Diga, 113-S. 38 March, 7. 39 Mahpulim 52-56. 40 March, 47. 19 Earth to broadcast the revelation. But as a man who expounds a truth that he himself has seen and who indicates a path that he himself has trodden, as a man who, having himself crossed by his own unaided efforts to the other bank of the river, helps others for cross over. 42. This fact must not lead us to make the figure of the Buddha too human, even if we omit the Bodhisattva theory that so often suffers from infiltration of fabulous elements, and that only came into being at a later period. The concept in the early texts of what is known as Kolankola makes us seek in the Buddha the re-emergence of a luminous principle already kindled in preceding generations. This is an idea that agrees perfectly with what we are about to say on the historical significance of the Buddhist doctrine of awakening. In any case, whatever his antecedents, it is extremely difficult to draw a line between what is human and what is not, when we are dealing with a being who has inwardly attained deathlessness, amata, and who is presented as the living incarnation of a law bound up with that which is transcendental and that can be confined by nothing. Apriyapana. The question of race comes in here, too. If a being feels himself remote from metaphysical reality, then he will imagine any strength that he may acquire as a grace. Knowledge will appear as revelation, in its accepted meaning in the West since the time of the Hebrew prophets, and the announcer of a law may assume for him divine proportions rather than be justly regarded as one who has destroyed ignorance and who has become awakened. This separation from metaphysical reality masks the dignity and the spiritual level of a teaching and wraps the person of the teacher himself in an impenetrable fog. One thing is certain, ideas of revelations and of men gods can only sound foreign to an iron spirit, and for a noble son, Kula Putta, particularly in periods when the mind of humanity had not yet entirely lost the memory of its own origins. This introduces us to the next chapter, where we shall say something of the meaning and of the function of the doctrine of Prince Siddhartha in the general setting of the ancient Indo-Aryan world. 41 Ibid. 26. 42 Satanict. 3, 6. 20. 3. The historical context of the doctrine of awakening. First, a word about method. From the traditional point of view that we follow in this work, the great historical traditions are to be considered neither as original nor as arbitrary. In every tradition worthy of the name, elements are always present, in one form or another, of a knowledge that, being rooted in a superindividual reality, is objective. Furthermore, each tradition contains its own special mode of interpretation and cannot be considered as arbitrary or as proceeding from extrinsic or purely human factors. This particular element tends to vary with the prevailing historical and spiritual climate, and we can find in it the reason for the existence of certain formulations, adaptations, or limitations of the one knowledge, and the non-existence of others. No one individual, suddenly, and as if inspired haphazardly by some outside agency, ever proclaimed the theory of the Avit Macron Avit Macron, for example, or invented Nirna or the Islamic theories. On the contrary, all traditions or doctrines obey, even without seeming to do so, a profound logic, discoverable by means of an adequate metaphysical interpretation of history. Accordingly, this shall be our standpoint when we deal with these aspects of Buddhism. This is also why we consider that critic to be fundamentally mistaken who tries at all costs to pin the label original on Buddhism or, indeed, on any great tradition, and who argues that, otherwise, such a tradition would in no way differ from others. A difference there is, as there is also an element in common with what has gone before, but both are determined, as we have said, by objective reasons, even though they may not always have been seen clearly by the individual exponents of particular historical trends. Having said this, we must go back to the pre-Buddhist Indo-Aryan traditions in order to find the precise implications of the Buddhist doctrine, and in them we must distinguish between two fundamental phases, the Vedic and the Brahmana Upanishad. With regard to the Vedas, which constitute the essential foundation of the entire 21 Tradition in question, it would not be correct to talk either of religion or of philosophy. To begin with, the term Veda, from the root vid, which is equivalent to the Greek id, whence we have, for example, Kant, and which means, I see, I have seen, refers to a doctrine based not on faith or revelation, but on a higher knowledge attained through a process of seeing. The Vedas were seen, they were seen by the seers of the earliest times. Throughout the tradition their essence has never been regarded as a faith, but rather as a sacred science. Thus it is frivolous to see in the Vedas, as many people do, the expression of a purely naturalistic religion. As in other great systems, impurities may be present, particularly where foreign matter has crept in, and very noticeably, for example, in the Atharva Ved. But what the essential and most ancient part of the Vedas reflects is a cosmic stage of the Indo-Aryan spirit. It is not a question of theories or of theologies, but of hymns containing a magnificent reflection of a consciousness that is still so harnessed to the cosmos and to metaphysical reality that the various gods of the Vedas are more than religious images. They are projections of the experience of significances and forces, directly perceived in man, in nature, or beyond through a cosmic, heroic, and sacrificial concept, freely and almost triumphantly. Although they were written considerably later, the fundamental thought contained in such epic poems as the Mahabharata goes back to the same epoch. Men, heroes, and divine figures appear side by side, and as Irene said when referring to the Olympian Homeric phase of the Aryo-Hellenic tradition, men could see the gods and be seen by them, and could stand with them in the original state of existence. The Olympian element is reflected also in a typical group of Vedic divinities, in Dios, from Dev, to shine, a root that is also found in Zeus and Zeus, for example, Lord of the heavenly light, the origin of splendor, strength, and knowledge, in Varuna, also a symbol of celestial and regal power, and connected with the idea of P.A. with Macron, that is to say, of the cosmos, of a cosmic order, of a natural and supernatural law, while in Mitra et Are is, in addition, the idea of a god of the specifically Aryan virtues, truth and fidelity. We also have Surya, the flaming sun from whom, as from the Olympian Nu Omicron Nu, nothing is hidden, who destroys every infirmity and who, in the form of Savita, is the light that is exalted in the first daily right of all the Aryan castes as the principle of awakening and intellectual animation. Oh, there is Usas, the dawn, eternally young, who opens the way for the sun, who gives life, and who is the token of immortality. In Lantra we find the incarnation of the heroic and metaphysical impulse of the first Hyperborean conquerors. Lantra is he, without whom men cannot win. He is the son of force, the lightning god of war, valor, and victory, the uneven. To some extent we can here refer to what K. Kereni has written on the sense of festivity, in La Religion Antica nel suo line fondamentali, Boitogna 1940. Chap. 2. 2 cf. Ibid, chaps. 4 and 5. 22 later of the enemies of the Aryans, of the Black the Sioux, and, consequently, of all the tortuous and titanic forces that attempt to climb the heavens, while at the same time he appears as the consolidator, as he who has consolidated the world. The same spirit is reflected, in varying degrees, in minor Vedic divinities, even in those tied to the most conditioned forms of existence. In the Vedas we find that this cosmic experience is evoked through the agency of sacrificial action. The sacrifice rite extends human experience into the non-human, and provokes and establishes communion between the two worlds in such a manner that the sacrificer, a figure as austere and majestic as the Roman Laman Dialis, assumes the traits of a god on earth, be it Deva, be it Sura. As for life after death, the Vedic solution is fully consonant with the oldest Aryo-Hellenic spirit. Images of obscure hells are almost entirely absent from the most ancient parts of the Vedas. The crisis of death is hardly noticed as such. In the Atharva Veda it is even considered as the effect of a hostile and demoniacal force that, with suitable rites, can be repulsed. The dead pass into an existence of splendor. That is also a return, and in which they once again take up their form, having laid aside all defects, return home, full of splendor. Unite thyself to thy form. 3. And again, we drank the soma, symbol of a sacred enthusiasm, we became immortal, we reached the light. 4. The symbolic Vedic rite of wiping out the tracks, so that the dead will not return among the living, well shows how the idea of reincarnation was almost totally absent in this period. Such a possibility was ignored in the light of the high degree of heroical, sacrificial, and metaphysical tension belonging to that epoch. There is no trace in the Vedas of the later significance of Yam as god of death and hell. Rather, he retains the outlines of his Irano-Aryan equivalent, Yama, sun king of the primordial age, son of the Sunday. Yam is the first of the mortals and he, who first found the road to the hereafter. 5. Thus, broadly speaking, the Vedic hereafter is bound up in great measure with the idea of a reintegration of the primordial state. About the 10th century BC new developments began. They found expression in the Brahmana texts on the one hand, and on the other in the Upanishad texts. Both go back to the tradition of the Vedas, yet there is a noteworthy change of perspective. We are slowly approaching philosophy and theology. The speculation of the Brahmana texts rests chiefly on that part of the Vedas that refers to ritual and sacrificial action. Ritual, in all the traditional civilizations, was conceived neither as an empty ceremony nor as a sentimental and, at the same time, formal act of praising and supplicating a god, but rather as an operation with real effects. As a process capable not only of establishing contacts with the 3 Ag Veda, 10.T4.8, 4 Ibid, 8.48.3, 5 Ibid, 10.14.2, 23 transcendent world, but of imposing itself upon supersensible forces and, through their mediation, eventually influencing even the natural forces. As such, ritual presupposes not only knowledge of certain laws, but also, and more essentially, the existence of a power. The term Brahman, in the neuter, not to be confused with Brahm in masculine, which designates the theistically conceived divinity, originally signified this particular energy, this kind of magic power, this fluid or life force, upon which the ritual rests. In the Brahmana texts this ritual aspect of the Vedic tradition was enlarged and formalized. Ritual became the center of everything and the object of a fastidious science, that often became a formalism destitute of any vital content. Alden Bed, referring to the period of Prince Siddhartha, talks in this connection of an idiotic science knows everything and explains everything, and sits enthroned, satisfied, amongst its extravagant creations. This judgment is excessive, but it is not entirely unjustified. In the Buddha's time there existed a caste of theology philosophantes who administered the remnants of the ancient tradition, trying with all the means in their power to establish a prestige that did not always correspond to their human qualifications or to their race, if not their physical race, which was well cared for by the caste system, at least their spiritual race. We have used the word theologists, since the concept of Brahman in these circles gradually became generalized and, in a manner of speaking, substantialized, to such an extent that the Brahman finally no longer signified the mysterious force that fundamentally only made sense in terms of ritual and magic experience. It came to mean the soul of the world, the supreme force substance of the universe, the substratum, indeterminate in itself, of every being and of every phenomenon. It thus became an almost theological concept. The Upanishads, on the other hand, concentrated mainly on the doctrine of the Evit Macron Evit Macron, which largely reflected the original cosmic and solar sentiment of the earliest Aryan consciousness, insofar as it stressed the reality of the I, as the superindividual, unchanging, and immortal principle of the personality, as opposed to the multiple variety of the phenomena and forces of nature. The Evit Macron is defined by Nathan Edge, not so. That is to say, by the idea that it does not belong to nature or, more generally, to the conditioned world. In India the speculative current of the Brahmana and that of the Upanishads gradually converged. This convergence resulted in the identification of the Brahman with the Evit Macron. The I, in its superindividual aspect, and the force substance of the cosmos became one and the same thing. This was a turning point of the greatest importance in the spiritual history of the Languayan civilization. The doctrine of the identity of the Evit Macron with the Brahman did, in fact, constitute a metaphysical achievement, but, at the 6th Oldenburg, Buddha, p. 24 same time, it initiated a process of breaking up and of spiritual dissolution. This process was bound to take place as shadows began to cloud the luminosity of the original heroic and cosmic experience of Vedic man and as foreign influences gained ground. Originally the doctrine of the Upanishads was considered as secret, as a knowledge to be transmitted only to the few. The term Upanishad itself conveyed this idea, but in point of fact the philosophical and speculative tendencies became uppermost. This resulted in divergencies of opinion even in the oldest Upanishad, the Chandogya, and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, as to the plane of consciousness to be used as the reference point for the doctrine. Is the Evit Macron object of immediate experience or is it not? T is both one and the other at the same time. Its substantial identity with the I of the individual is affirmed, but, at the same time, we often see the unity of the individual with the Evit Macron Brahman postponed till after death, and not only this, but conditions are postulated under which it will happen, and the case is considered in which the one, or rather the elements of the person, may not leave the cycle of finite and mortal existences. In the ancient Upanishads, in fact, no precise solution is ever reached of the problem of the actual relationship existing between the individual, one, of which everyone can talk, and the Evit Macron Brahman. We do not consider that this was accidental. It was a circumstance that corresponded to an already uncertain state of consciousness, to the fact that, while For the adepts of the secret doctrine, the I could be equated effectively with the A with Macron TMA with Macron. For the general consciousness, the A with Macron TMA with Macron was becoming a simple speculative concept, an almost theological assumption, since the inner spiritual level was beginning to be lost. Furthermore, the danger of pantheistic confusions showed itself. This danger did not exist in theory since, in the Upanishads, following the Vedic concept, the supreme principle was not only conceived as the substance of the world and of all beings, but also as that which transcends them, by 3/4, existing as the immortal in the heavens. In the same Upanishads, however, prominence is also given to the identity of the A with Macron TMA with Macron Brahman with elements of all kinds in the naturalistic world, so that the practical possibility of a pantheistic deviation encouraged by the assimilation of the A with Macron TMA with Macron with the Brahman was real, particularly so if we take into account the process of man's gradual regression, of which we can find evidence in the teaching of all traditions, including the Doctrine, where the theory of the 4 yuga corresponds exactly to the classical theory of the 4 ages and of man's descent to the last of them, the Iron Age, equivalent to the Dark Age, Kali Yuga, of the Indo-Aryans. If, during the period of these speculations, the original cosmic and Uranic consciousness of the Vedic origins had already suffered in this way a certain overclouding, then the formulation of the theory of the identity of the A with Macron TMA with Macron, with the RG Veda, 10.903, Chandogya Upanishad, 3.T2.6. 25 Brahman provided a dangerous incentive toward evasion, toward a confused self-identification with the spirituality of everything, at the very moment when a particularly energetic reaction by way of a tendency toward concentration, detachment, and awakening was needed. Altogether, the germs of decadence, which were already showing themselves in the post-Vedic period and which were to become quite evident in the Buddha's day, 6th century BC, are as follows. Above all, a stereotyped ritualism, then the demon of speculation, whose effect was that what ought to have remained secret doctrine, Upanishad, Rahasya, became partly rationalized, with the result that there eventually appeared a tumultuous crowd of divergent theories, sects, and schools, which the Buddhist texts often vividly describe. In the third place, we find a religious transformation of many divinities who in the Vedic period were, as we have said, simply cosmically transfigured states of consciousness. These have now become objects of popular cults. We have already spoken of the pantheistic danger. In addition to these points, we have yet to consider the effect of foreign, non-iron influences, to which we believe are attributable, in no small degree, the formation and diffusion of the theory of reincarnation. As we have said, there is no trace of this theory in the early Vedic period. This is because it is quite incompatible with an Olympian and heroic vision of the world, being as it is a truth of non-iron races that are tellurically and matriarchally adjusted in outlook. Reincarnation, in fact, is conceivable only by one who feels himself to be a son of the earth, who has no knowledge of a reality transcending the naturalistic order, bound, as he is to a female maternal divinity found alike in the pre-iron Mediterranean world, and in the pre-iron Hindu civilization, such as the Dravidian and Koslian, into the source from which as an ephemeral being he has stoning. The individual, when he dies, must return, only to reappear in fresh terrestrial truths, in an inescapable and interminable cycle. This is the ultimate sense of the theory of reincarnation, a theory that begins to infiltrate as early as the period of Upanishad speculations. It gives place gradually to mixed forms that we can use as a measure of the change in the original iron consciousness to which we have referred. While in the Vedas only a single fate after death is considered, as in ancient Hellas, in the Brahmana texts the theory of the double way already appears. Only he who knows and practices ritual action rises again in life and obtains immortal life. H.C.F. Diga, 1st January 1929 F.F. Satanipata, 4.12, 13. 9. It is essentially of these gods that we must think when we see them assume, in Buddhist texts, quite modest and subordinate parts, transforming themselves sometimes almost into quasi-disciples who receive revelation of the doctrine from the Buddha. We are dealing, that is, with the degradation of the ancient gods, and the doctrine revealed by the above. And one corresponds, basically, with what they once signified, but which at this period had been forgotten. 2. Others who neither know nor practice ritual action will continue to be born anew, as nourishment for death. 10. In the Upanishads, however, as the relationship between the real I and the Atma oscillates, so does their teaching of what happens after death. They speak of the dike, beyond which even night becomes day. Sign. The world of the Brahman is unchangeable light, a dike constituted by the Atma against which neither decay, nor death, nor pain, nor good action, nor bad action can prevail. 11. They speak of the way of the gods, Devayana, that leads one after death to the unconditioned whence there is no return. But at the same time another road is considered, the Pitayana, along which one returns. The individual after death being little by little sacrificed to various divinities for whom he becomes food. Finally to reappear on the earth. 12 In the oldest texts the possibility of a liberation is not considered for those who go in this second road. They speak instead of the casual law of the karma, which determines a man's subsequent existence on the basis of what he has done in the preceding one. We have now arrived at what we shall call samsaric consciousness, from samsara, which is the keystone of the Buddhist vision of life, the secret knowledge, confided privately by the wise Yajnavalkya to the key. Ng Artavaga, is that after death the individual elements of man dissolve in the corresponding cosmic elements including the Atma, which returns to the here, and that which is left is only the karma, that is, the action, the impersonal fume, bound to the life of one being, that will go on to determine a new as. In all nits can he seen, then, more than just the effect of free metaphysical speculation. It is, rather, a sign of a consciousness that begins to consider itself terrestrial, or, at the most, pantheistically, cosmic, and that now centers itself on that part of the human being that may really be concerned with death and rebirth and indefinite wandering across various forms of conditioned existence. We say, various, since the horizons gradually widened and it was even thought that one might realize in this or that world of gods, according to one's actions. In any case, in the epoch in which Buddhism appeared, the theories of reincarnation and of transmigration were already an integral part of the ideas acquired by the predominant mentality. Sometimes, and even in the Upanishads, different outlooks became indiscriminately combined so that on the one side was conceived an Atma that, although divorced from any concrete experience, was supposed to be permanently and intangibly present in every tune, and on the other side, there was the interminable wandering of man in various lives. It is on his lines that practical and realistic currents gradually established. 10 Satpata Brahmana, 10.4.3 10, 11 Chandogya Upanishad, 8.4.1-2, 12 Vivid, 3-10, Brahadrani aka Upanishad, 6.2.9-16, 13 Brahadrani aka Upanishad, 3.2.13, 27 themselves in opposition to the speculative currents. We can include Sankhya, which opposed to the pantheistic danger a rigid dualism and in which the reality of the I, or A with Macron TMA with Macron, called here Purus, as the supernatural, intangible, and unalterable principle is opposed to all the forms, forces, and phenomena of a natural and material order. But more important in this respect are the trends of yoga, based both on Sankhya and on ascetic tendencies already coming to the fore in opposition to ritualistic and speculative Brahmanism. These recognized more or less explicitly the new state of affairs, which was that in speaking of L, one could no longer concretely understand the A with Macron TMA with Macron, the unconditioned principle, that it appeared no longer as direct consciousness, and that, therefore, apart from speculation, it could only be considered as an end, as the limit of a process of reintegration with action as its basis. As the immediate real datum there was substituted instead what we call samsaric consciousness and existence, consciousness, bound to the current, and the tendum samsara, which thus only makes a relatively late appearance, means precisely current. It is the current of becoming. It is not out of place to consider another point. The Brahmana caste is habitually thought of in the West as a sacerdotal caste. This is true only up to a certain point. In the Vedic origins the type of Brahman or sacrificer bears little resemblance to that of the priest. As our contemporaries think of him, he was, rather, a figure both virile and awful, and, as we have said, a kind of visible incarnation in the human world of the superhuman, Buddheva. Furthermore, we often find in the early texts the point where the distinction between the Brahman, the sacerdotal caste, and the Kshatram or Jam, the warrior or regal caste, did not exist, a feature that we see in the earliest stages of all traditional civilizations, including the Greek, Roman, and German. The two types only began to differ in a later period, this being another aspect of the process of regression that we have mentioned. Besides, there are many who maintain that in Iron India the doctrine of the A with Macron TMA with Macron was originally confuted almost exclusively to the warrior caste, and that the doctrine of Brahman as an undifferentiated cosmic force was formulated mainly by the sacerdotal caste. There is probably some truth in this view. In any case, it is a fact that in many texts, we see a king or a Kshatriya, a member of the warrior nobility, vying in knowledge with, and sometimes even instructing members of the Brahman caste, and that, according to tradition, primordial knowledge was handed down, starting from Ikshvaku, in regal succession. 14 The same, solar divine Asti, Suryavamsa, that we mention in connection with the Buddha's family, also figures here. We should have the following picture. In the Indo-Aryan post-Vedic world, while the warrior caste held a more realistic and virile view, and put emphasis on the doctrine of the Atma as the unchangeable and immortal principle of human personality, the Brahman caste was becoming 14 cf Bhagavad Gita, 4.1-2, 28 little by little, sacerdotal, and, instead of facing the reality, was moving among ritual and stereotyped exegeses and speculations. Simultaneously, in another way, the character of the first Vedic period was becoming overgrown with a tropical and chaotic vegetation of myths and popular religious images, even of semi-devotional practices seeking the attainment of this, that, or the other divine rebirth, on the basis of views on reincarnation and transmigration that, as we have said, had already infiltrated into the less illuminated Indo-Aryan mentalities. Leaving yoga apart, it is worth noting that it was the warrior nobility, the Kshatram, that furnished the principal support not only of the Sukya system, which is regarded as representing a clear reaction against speculative idealism, but also of Jainism, the so-called doctrine of the conquerors, from Jina, conqueror, which laid emphasis, though with a tendency to extremism, on necessity for ascetic action. All this is necessary for our understanding of the historical place of Buddhism, and of the reasons of its most characteristic views. From the point of view of universal history, Buddhism arose in a period marked by a crisis running through a whole series of traditional civilizations. This crisis sometimes resolved itself positively thanks to opportune reforms and revisions, and sometimes negatively with the effect of inducing further phases of regression or spiritual decadence. This period, called by some the climacteric of civilization, falls approximately between the 8th and the 5th centuries BC. It is in this period that the doctrines of Lao Tzu and Confucius, were taking root in China, representing a renewal of elements of the most ancient tradition on the metaphysical plane on the one hand, and on the ethical social on the other. In the same period it is said that Zarathustra appeared, through whom a similar return took place in the Persian tradition, and in India the same function was performed by Buddhism, also representing a reaction and, at the same time, a re-elevation. On the other hand, as we have often pointed out elsewhere, it seems that in the West processes of decadence mainly prevailed. The period of which we are now talking is, in fact, that in which the ancient aristocratic and hieratic Hellas declined, in which the religion of Isis along with other popular and spurious forms of mysticism superseded the solar and regal Egyptian civilization. It is that in which Israelite prophecy started the most dangerous ferments of corruption and subversion in the Mediterranean world. The only positive counterpart in the West seems in fact to have been Rome, which was born in that period and which for a certain cycle was a creation of universal importance, animated in high measure by an Olympian and heroic spirit. 15. Coming to Buddhism, it was not conceived, as many who unilaterally take the Brahman point of view like to claim, as an anti-traditional revolution, similar, in its 15 on his significance of Rome as a rebirth of a primordial iron heritage CFR. Revolt against the modern world, Part 2. 29 on way to what the Lutheran heresy was to Catholicism, 16 and still less as a new doctrine, the result of an isolated speculation that succeeded in taking root. It represented, rather, a particular adaptation of the original Indo-Aryan tradition, an adaptation that kept in mind the prevailing conditions and limited itself accordingly, while freshly and differently formulating pre-existent teachings. At the same time Buddhism closely adhered to the Kshatriya, in play, Katya, spirit, the spirit of the warrior caste. We have already seen that the Buddha was born of the most ancient Aryan nobility, but this is not the end of the matter, as a text informs us of the particular aversion nourished by his people for the Brahman caste. The Skya, Skya, we read 17, do not esteem the priests. They do not respect the priests. They do not honor the priests. They do not venerate the priests. They do not hold the priests of account. The same tendency is maintained by Prince Siddhartha, but with the aim of restoring, of reaffirming, the pure will for the unconditioned, to which in the most recent times the regal line had often been more faithful than the priestly caste that was already divided within itself. There are, besides, many signs that the Buddhist doctrine laid no claim to originality, but regarded itself as being, in a way, universal and having a traditional character in a superior sense. The Buddha himself says, for example, thus it is, those who, in times past, were saints, perfect awakened ones, these sublime men also have rightly directed their disciples for such an end, as now disciples are rightly directly here by me, and those who in future times will be saints, perfect awakened ones, also these sublime men will rightly direct their disciples, as now disciples are rightly directed here by me. 18. The same is repeated in regard to purification of thought, word, and action. 19. It is repeated about tight knowledge of decay and death, of their origin, of their cessation and of the way that leads to their cessation, and it is repeated about the doctrine of the void, or emptiness. Sanat. 20. The doctrine and the divine life, proclaimed by Prince Siddhartha, are repeatedly called timeless. Akliko. 21. Ancient saints, perfect awakened ones, are spoken of. 22. And a traditional hymn occurs in connection with a place, here, called the Gorge of the Seer, where a 16. This is the point of view held by Arganon, Elhame et Son de Venir Selon le Vedanta, Paris, 1925, p. 111 ff, with which we cannot, according to truth, agree. English Iran's. Man and His Becoming according to the Vedanta, London, I 945. More correct are the views of A.K. Kumaraswamy, Hinduism and Buddhism, New York, T 941. In this book is apparent the tendency to emphasize only what in Buddhism is valuable from the Brahmana standpoint, with disregard of RHE specific functional meaning he possesses as compared to Hindu tradition. 17 Vika. 3rd January 2012. 18 March, 51. 19 Ibid. 61. 20 Samyukta, T2.33. 21 March, 7. 22 Ibid. 75, CF 81. 30. Whole series of Paxka Buddha are supposed to have vanished in the past, a series, that is, of beings who, by their own unaided and isolated efforts, have reached the superhuman state and the same perfect awakening as did Prince Siddhartha himself. 23 Those who are without faith, without devotion, without tradition 24 are reproached. A repeated saying is, what for the world of the sages is not, of that I say, it is not, and what for the world of sages is, of that I say, too is. 25 An interesting point is the mention in a text of extinction. The aim of the Buddhist assesses, as something that leads back to the origins. 26 This is supported by the symbolism of a great forest where an ancient path, a path of men of olden times, is discovered. Following it, the Buddha finds a royal city, and he asks that it should be restored. Another text. The significance of this is explained by the Buddha in a most explicit way. I have seen the ancient path, the path trodden by all the perfected, awakened ones of olden times. This is the path I follow. 28. It is quite clear, then, that in Buddhism we are not dealing with a negation of the principle of spiritual authority but rather with a revolt against a caste that claimed to monopolize this authority while its representatives no longer preserved its dignity and had lost their qualifications. The Brahmans, against whom Prince Siddhartha turns, are those who say they know, but who know nothing. 29 W. Who for many generations have lost the faculty of direct vision, without which they cannot even say, only this is truth. Foolishness is the rest. 30 And who now resemble a file of blind men, in which the first cannot see, the one in the middle cannot see, and the last cannot see. 31 Very different from the men of the original period, from the Brahmana who remembered the ancient rule, who guarded the door of the senses, who had entirely controlled their impulses, and who were ascetics, rich only in knowledge, inviolable and invincible, made strong by truth, Dhamma, were their worldly successors, who were wrapped up in ritualism or intent on vain fasting and who had abandoned the ancient laws. 32 Of these, there is not one who has seen Brahm face to face, whence it is impossible that these Brahmana, versed in the science of the threefold Vedas. 23 Ibid. 116, cf 123. 24 Ibid. 102. 25 Samyukta, 22.94. 26 Matpurindev, 52-53. This is the Chinese version of the rakes, however. 27 Samyukta, 12.65. 26 Ibid. 3.T06. It is interesting that according to the myth, Buddha attained the awakening under the tree of life placed in the Navate of the earth where Itso at it the previous Buddha reached transcendent knowledge. This is a reference to the center of the world, which is to be considered, in its way, as a prism of traditionality and initiatic of orthodoxy, whenever a contact with the origins was restored. 29 March, 93. 30 Ibid. 95. 3 Idika, 13.15, March 95, 99. 32 Satanikta, 2.7.1-16. 31 are capable of indicating the way to a state of companionship with that which they neither know nor have seen. The Buddha is opposed to one who knows only by hearsay, to one who knows the truth only by repetition, and who, with this traditionally heard truth, as a coffer handed down from hand to hand, transmits the doctrine, the integrity of which, however, it is impossible to guarantee in such circumstances. A distinction is therefore made between the ascetics and Brahmins who, only by their own creed profess to have reached the highest perfection of knowledge of the world, such are the reasoners, and the disputers, and other ascetics and Brahmins who, in things never before heard, recognize clearly in themselves the frith, and profess to have reached the highest perfection of knowledge of the world. It is to these latter that Prince Siddhartha claims to belong, and this is the type that he indicates to his disciples. 35. Only when he knows does he say that he knows, only when he has seen does he say that he has seen. 36. Regarded from this standpoint, Buddhism does not deny the concept of Brahmana. On the contrary, the texts use the word frequently, and call the ascetic life Brahmacharya, their intention being simply to indicate the fundamental qualities in virtue of which the dignity of the true Brahmana can be confirmed. 37. Here, with the aim being essentially one of reintegration, the qualities of the true Brahmana and of the ascetic become identified. These notions had previously been distinct, particularly when the asrama teaching of the Iron Code, according to which a man of Brahman caste was obliged to graduate to a completely detached life, Vanaprastha, or Yati, had practically and with but few exceptions disappeared. By understanding this point we can also understand the Buddha's true attitude to the problem of caste. Even in the preceding tradition ascetic achievement had been considered as above all caste and free from obligations to any of them. This is the Buddha's point of view, expressed in a simile, as one who desires fire does not ask the type of wood that in fact produces it, so from any caste may arise an ascetic or an awakened one. 38 The castes appeared to Prince Siddhartha, as they did to every traditional mind, as perfectly natural and furthermore justified transcendentally, since in following the doctrine of the Upanishads he understood that birth in one caste or another and inequality in general were not accidental but the effect of a particular preceding action. This he was never concerned with upsetting the caste system on the ethnic, political, or social plane. On the contrary, it is laid down that a man should not omit any of the obligations inherent in his station in life. 39 And it is never said that. 35 March 100. 36 Ibid. 77. 37 Ibid. 48 Dhammapta. 383 ff. Satanipta 3.4. Passim 9.27. Passim T.7. 38 March 93. 90. 39 Mathvarindev 6 to 11. 32 A servant, Sudha, SKT. Sudra, or a Vaisya, SKT. Vaisya, should not obey higher iron castes. The problem only concerns the spiritual apex of the iron hierarchy, where historical conditions required discrimination and revision of the matter. It was necessary that the lists should be reviewed and reconstructed, with the traditional dignities being considered real only on the merits of the individual cases. 40 The decisive point was the identification of the true Brahman with the ascetic and, thence, the emphasis placed on what in fact is evidenced by action. Thus the principle was proclaimed, not by caste is one a pariah, not by caste is one a Brahmana, by actions is one a pariah, by actions is one a Brahmana. 41 In respect of the flame that is sustained by virtue, and lighted by training, as in respect of liberation, the four castes are equal. 42 And again, as it is not to be expected in answer to a man's invocations, prayers, and praises, so it is not to be expected that the Brahmana who, although they are instructed in the triple Veda yet, omit the practice of those qualities that make a man a true Brahmana can, by calling upon Indira, Soma, Varuna and other gods, acquire those qualities that really make a man a non-Brahmana. 43 If they have not destroyed desire for the five stems of sense experience, they can as little expect to unite themselves after death with Brahm as a man, swimming, can expect to reach the other bank with his arms tied to his body. 44 To unite himself with Brahm a man must develop in himself qualities similar to Brahm. 45 This, however, in no way prevents the consideration in the texts of the ideal Brahmana, in whom the purity of the iron lineage is joined with qualities which make him like a god or a divine being. 46 And the texts even go so far as to reprove the contemporary Brahmins not only for their desertion of ancient customs and for their interest in gold and riches, but also for their betrayal of the laws of marriage within the caste, for they are accused of frequenting non-Brahman women at all times from mere desire, like dogs. 47 The general principle of any right hierarchy is confirmed with these words: in serving a man, if for this service one becomes worse, not better, this man, I say, one ought not to serve. In serve, ing a man, on the other hand, if for this service one becomes better, not worse, this man, I say, one ought to serve. 48 This shows that there is no question here of equalitarian subversion under spiritual pretexts, but of rectification and operation of the existing hierarchy. Prince 40 March 84 40 Sataniptu 1.7.2t 42 March 90 43 Diga. 13.24 25 44 Ibid 13.26 28 Satanipta 2nd February 2011 45 Diga 13.33 38 46 46 Angad. 5.t92 47 Ibid 5.191 Wall 3 P22TF 48 March 96 33 Siddharth Tha has so little sympathy for the masses that in one of the oldest texts he speaks of the common crowd as a heap of rubbish, where there takes place the miraculous flowering of the awakened one. 49 Beyond the ancient division into castes, Buddhism affirms another that, deeper and more intimate, mutatis mutandis, is not unlike the one that originally existed between the ions, those twice born, Dvya, and other beings. On one side stand the Arya and the noble sons moved by confidence, to whom the doctrine of awakening is accessible; on the other, the common men, without understanding for what is saintly, remote from the saintly doctrine, not accessible to the saintly doctrine, without understanding for what is noble, remote from the doctrine of the noble ones, not accessible by the doctrine of the noble ones. 50 If, on the one hand, as rivers, when they reach the ocean lose their former names and are reckoned only as ocean, so the members of the four castes, when they take up the law of the Buddha, lose their final characteristics, yet on the other they form a well-defined company, the Sons of the SA with Macron. K. Ya's son, 51. We can see that the effective aim of Buddhism was to discriminate between different natures, for which the touchstone was the doctrine of awakening itself, a discrimination that could not do other than stimulate the spiritual bases that originally had themselves been the sole justification of the iron hierarchy. In confirmation of this is the fact how the establishment and diffusion of Buddhism never in later centuries caused dissolution of the caste system. Even today in Ceylon this system continues undisturbed side by side with Buddhism, while, in Japan, Buddhism lives in harmony with hierarchical, traditional, national, and warrior concepts. Only in certain Western misconceptions is Buddhism considered in later and corrupted forms, presented as a doctrine of universal compassion encouraging humanitarianism and democratic equality. The only point we must take with a grain of salt in the texts is the affirmation that in individuals of all castes all possible potentialities, both positive and negative, exist in equal measure. But the Buddhist theory of Sankara, that is, of prenatal predispositions, is enough to rectify this point. The exclusiveness of caste, race, and tradition in a hierarchical system results in the individual possessing hereditary predispositions for his development in a particular direction. His ensures an organic and harmonious character in his development, as opposed to the cases in which an attempt is made to reach the same point with a kind of violence, by starting from a naturally unfavorable base. Four ways are considered in some Buddhist texts: 53 in 49 Dhammapada, 59 to 59, 50 March, I, 51 Angat, 8.T9, I4, 10.96, 52 March, 96, 53. Angat, 4.T62, 34 3 of which either the road or the achievement of knowledge is difficult, or both are difficult. The fourth way offers an easy road and easy attainment of knowledge. This way is called the path of the elect, and it is reserved for those who enjoy the advantages bestowed by a good birth. At least it would have been so had circumstances been normal. But, let us repeat, Buddhism appeared in abnormal conditions in a particular traditional civilization. It is for this reason that Buddhism placed emphasis on the aspect of action and of individual achievement, and it is also for this reason that the support offered by tradition, in its most restricted sense, was held of little account. Prince Siddhartha stated that he himself had attained knowledge through his own efforts, without a master to show him the way. So, in the original doctrine of awakening, each individual has to rely on himself, and on his own exertions, just as a soldier who is lost must rely on himself alone to rejoin the marching army. Thus Buddhism, if a comparison of various traditions were being made, could legitimately take its place with a race that elsewhere we have called heroic, in the sense of the Hesiodic teaching on the four ages. 5. 4. We mean a type of man in which the spirituality belonging to the primordial state is no longer taken for granted as something natural, for this tradition is no longer itself an adequate foundation. Spirituality has become an aim to him, the object of a reconquest, the final limit of a reintegration to be carried out by one's own virile efforts. This ends our account of the historical place of Buddhism, an essential prerequisite for understanding the meaning of its principal teachings and the reasons for their existence. Before going on to discuss the doctrine and the practice, we must return to a point we have already mentioned, that is, that Buddhism belongs to a cycle that modern man can also comprehend. Although in the epoch in which Prince Siddhartha lived there was already a certain clouding over of spiritual consciousness and of metaphysical vision of the world such as was possessed by ancient Indo-Aryan man, the later course of history, and particularly of Western history, has produced an increasing amount of regression, materialism, and individualism together with a corresponding loss of direct contact with metaphysical and, generally speaking, supersensible reality. With the modern world we have come to a point beyond which it would be difficult to go. The object of direct knowledge for modern man is exclusively the material world, with its counterpart, the purely psychological sphere of his subjectivity. His philosophical speculations and his religion stand apart. The first are purely cerebral creations, the second is based essentially on faith. It is not entirely a case of Western religion, as opposed to the highest traditions. 54 CR Revolt against the Madam World. Chap. 22. 35 of the most ancient time, having centered itself on faith, thereby hoping to save what yet could be saved. It is, rather, a counsel of despair. A man who has long since lost all direct contact with the metaphysical world can only adopt one possible form of religio, of reconnection, namely, that provided by belief or faith. It is in this way that we can also come to understand the real significance of Protestantism as compared with Catholicism. Protestantism took root in a period when humanism and naturalism were ushering in a phase of secularization of European man, a process that went much further than the normal regression of the epoch in which Christianity in general arose, and at the same time decadence and corruption appeared among the representatives of the Catholic tradition, to whom had been entrusted the task of support and mediation. These being the real circumstances and the rift having thus grown wider, the principle of the pure faith was emphasized and opposed to any hierarchical organization and mediation. A distrust of works, even the Christian monastic asceticism was included in this, was nourished. These are tendencies that are characteristic of Protestantism. The present crisis of Western religions based on belief is known to all, and we need not point out the completely secular, materialistic and samsaric character of the mentality predominant in our contemporaries. We are entitled to ask ourselves, under these circumstances, what a system, based rigorously on knowledge, free from elements of both faith and intellectualism, not tied to local organized tradition, but in reality directed towards the unconditioned, may have to offer. It is evident that this path is only suited to a very small minority, gifted with exceptional interior strength. Original Buddhism, in this respect, can be recommended as can few other doctrines, particularly because when it was formulated the condition of mankind, although still far from the straits of Western materialism and the subsequent eclipse of any living traditional knowledge, nevertheless, manifested some of these signs and symptoms. Nor must we forget that Buddhism, as we have said, is a practical and realistic adaptation of traditional ideas, an adaptation that is mainly in the spirit of the Kshatriya, of the iron warrior caste. It should be remembered, especially since Western man's line of development has been warlike rather than a sacerdotal, while his inclination for clarity, for realism, and for exact knowledge, applied on the material plane, has produced the most typical achievements of his civilization. Other metaphysical and ascetic systems might appear more attractive than Buddhism, and might offer a deeper gratification for a mind anxiously trying to penetrate the mysteries of the world and of existence, yet they tend proportionately to provide modern man with opportunities for illusions and misconceptions, the reason being that genuinely traditional systems, such as the Vedanta, if they are to be fully understood and realized, presuppose a degree of spirituality that has disappeared long ago. 36 In the vast majority of men, Buddhism, on the other hand, poses a total problem, without any loopholes. As someone has rightly said, it is no milk for babies. 55 Nor does it provide metaphysical feasts for lovers of intellectual speculation. 56 It states, man, this is what you have become and this is what your experience has become. Know it. There is a way which leads beyond. This is its direction, these are its milestones, these are the means for following it. It rests with you to discover your true vocation and to measure your strength. Do not persuade, do not dissuade, knowing persuasion, knowing dissuasion. Neither persuade, nor dissuade, expound only reality. We have already seen that this is the fundamental precept of the awakened ones. Thus, in describing the historical place of Buddhism, we have also explained the last of the reasons we adopted to justify the choice of Buddhism as a basis for a study of a complete and virile ascesis, formulated with regard to the cycle that also includes contemporary man. 55, in English in the original. Trans. 56 R. H. Y. S. Davids, Early Buddhism, London, 1908, p. 7. 37 4. Destruction of the demon of dialectics. The premise from which the Buddhist doctrine of awakening starts is the destruction of the demon of dialectics, the renunciation of the various constructions of thought and speculation, which are simply an expression of opinion, and of the profusion of theories, which are projections of a fundamental restlessness in which a mind that has not yet found in itself its own principle seeks for support. This applies not only to cosmological speculation, but also to problems concerned with man, his nature and destiny, and even to any conceptual determination of the ultimate aim of asceticism. Have I ever existed in past epochs? Or have I never existed? What was I in past epochs? And how did I come to be what I was? Shall I exist in future epochs? Or shall I not exist? What shall I be in future epochs? And how shall I become what I shall be? And even the present fills the common man with doubts. Do I indeed exist? Or do I not exist? What am one? And how am I? This being here, whence has it really come? And whither will it go? All these for Buddhism are but vain thoughts. This is called the blind alley of opinions, the gorge of opinions, the bramble of opinions, the thicket of opinions, the net of opinions, caught up and lost in which, if ignorant, worldling cannot free himself from birth, decay and death. And again, I am, is an opinion, I am this is an opinion, I shall be, is an opinion, I shall not be, is an opinion, I shall he in the worlds of pure form, is an opinion, I shall be in the worlds free from form, is an opinion, conscious, I shall be, is an opinion, unconscious, I shall be, is an opinion, neither conscious nor unconscious, I shall he, is an opinion, opinion, o disciples, is a disease, opinion is a tumor, opinion is a sore. He who has overcome all opinion, O disciples, is called a saint, one who knows, 2. 1 March 2.38. 2 Ibid, T40. 38 It is the same with the cosmological order. The world is eternal, the world is not eternal, the world is ephemerate, the world is infinite, the life principle and the body are the same, the life principle is one thing, the body another, the accomplished one is after death, the accomplished one is not after death, the accomplished one both is and is not after death, the accomplished one neither is nor is not after death. This is a blind alley of opinions, a thicket of opinions, a wood of opinions, a tangle of opinions, a labyrinth of opinions, painful, desperate, tortuous, not leading to detachment, not leading to progress, not leading to vision, not leading to awakening, not leading to extinction. The doctrine of the accomplished ones is described as that which destroys to the foundations every attachment to and satisfaction in false theories, dogmas and systems, and which therefore cuts off both fear and hope. The reply to the question asked of the Buddha, perhaps Lord Gautama, this is the Prince Siddhartha's family name, has some opinion, is categorical, opinion, that is remote from the accomplished one. The accomplished one has seen. 5. This reply indicates the fundamental point. It is not that Buddhism intended to exclude the possibility of obtaining some answer to these problems, for by doing so it would fall into contradiction, since the texts offer, where necessary, fairly precise teachings with regard to certain of them. It has, rather, wished to oppose the demon of dialectics and has rejected every truth that is based only on discursive intellect, Vaikaka, and that can only have the value of opinion, of delta alpha. T keeps its distance from reasoners and disputers, for they can reason well and reason badly, they can say thus, and they can also say otherwise. 6 And they deal with theories that are only their own excogitations. And the alpha phi eta lambda epsilon pi nu tau alpha, the take away all of the Buddhist assesses is by no means a sacrificium intellectus in favor of faith, as in some forms of Christian mysticism. T is, rather, a preliminary catharsis, and opus purgation is justified by a superior type O criterion of certainty, which is rooted in an actual knowledge, acquired, as in the early Vedic tradition, by immediate vision. T is a criterion of direct experience. Once cut off from faith, from inclinations, from hearsay, from scholastic arguments, from ratiocinations and from reasoning, from pleasure in speculation, the same criterion serves the Buddha when deciding the existence or non-existence of a thing, as it serves a man who judges the existence of pleasure, pain, or delusion on the basis of having himself experienced these states. Besides, much knowledge, discursive knowledge that is, leaves an individual as he is, it does not contribute at all to the removal of the triple bond necessary to 3 Ibid, 72, 4 Ibid, 22, 5 Ihig, 72, 6 Ibid, 76, 7 Samyukta, 35,152, 39 Advance towards superior knowledge, already master in fact of deep psychology. The Buddha recognized that vain speculation and the posing of numberless problems reflect a state or restlessness and anguish, that is, the very state that must first be put behind him by one going along the path of the Arya. That is why, in the parable of the hunter, the inclination of a disciple at a certain point in his development to set himself the usual problems concerning the soul and the world is considered as a step backward. It is one of the baits laid down by the enemy, and any man who feeds on it falls back into his power. To know by seeing, to become cognition, to become truth, to become vision, this is the ideal, knowing seeing in conformity to reality, yaktutanna dasana, direct, intellectual intuition, far beyond all discussion and closely bound up with ascetic realization. Recognizing the poverty of philosophical opinions, not adhering to any of them, seeking the truth. I saw, 10 A recurring passage in the Pali Canon is, he, the accomplished one, shows this world with its angels, its good and bad spirits, its ranks of ascetics and brahmans, of gods and men, after he himself has known and apprehended it, etc. In discord there are even more radical expressions. I affirm, says Prince Siddhartha, that I can expound the law concerning this or that region in such a manner that he who acts in conformity therewith will recognize the existing as existing and the non-existing as not existing, the vulgar as vulgar and the noble as noble, the superable as superable and the insuperable as insuperable, the possible as possible and the impossible as impossible, that he will know, understand and apprehend this exactly as it is to be known, understood and apprehended. The supreme form of knowledge is knowledge conforming to reality. A higher and more sublime knowledge does not exist. I say, and again, a perfect, awakened one you call yourself. It is true, but these things you have not known. That an ascetic or a Brahman, a god or a demon, Brahma or anyone else in the world can thus accuse me justly. This possibility, says Prince Siddhartha, does not exist. 2012 The wise man, the Arya, is not a follower of systems, he does not recognize dogmas, and having penetrated the opinions current among the people and being indifferent in face of speculation, he leaves it to others. He remains calm among the agitated. He does not take part in the verbal battles of those who maintain, this only is the truth. He does not consider himself equal to others, nor superior, nor inferior. 13. In the canonical texts, after a description of the morass of contemporary philosophical opinions, we meet with this passage: the accomplished one knows other things well beyond such speculations, and having such knowledge he dues not. 8 March 113, cf. Satanipra. 5th August 2002. 9 March 25, cf. Samyukta. 35.207. 10 Satanipta. 4.92. 11 Angat. 9.22. 12 Ibid. 4.8, March 12. 13 Satanipta. 4th May 2004. 13.10-19. 40. Become proud. He remains impassive. He realizes in his mind the path that leads beyond. There are 0 disciples, other things, profound things, things difficult to apprehend, hard to understand, but that beget calm, joyful things, things not to be grasped simply by discursive thought, things that only the wise man can understand. These things are expounded by the accomplished one, after he himself has known them, after he himself has seen them. 14. We already know that the title Buddha, given to Prince Siddhartha and then extended to all those who have followed his path, means awakened. T takes us to the same point, to the same criterion of certainty. The doctrine of the Arya is called beyond imagination. 15. And not susceptible of assimilation by any process of ratiocination. The term Quaker often recurs, a term that means just that which cannot be apprehended by logic. Instead, the doctrine is presented in an awakening, and as an awakening, one can set at once the correspondence between this mode of knowing and Plato's view of anamnesis, reminiscence, or recollection, overcoming the state of oblivion, exactly as Buddhism aims to overcome the state produced by the sabba, by the intoxicants, by the manias, by the fever. These terms, reminiscence and awakening, however, should not represent more than the manner in which knowledge appears, than recognition and appraisal of something as directly evident, like a man who remembers or who wakes and sees something. This is the reason for the recurrence in later Buddhist literature of the term spota, which has a similar meaning. It is knowledge manifested as in an unveiling, as if an eye, after undergoing an operation, were to reopen and see. Dhammakakna, the eye of truth, or of reality, cacument, to be gifted with the eye, are normal Buddhist expressions, just as the technical term for conversion is his eye of truth opened. Where the Buddha speaks of his own experiences, we often find references to the pure presentation of knowledge, either directly or in similes never before heard or thought of. 16. Here is another leitmotif of the texts, as something never heard of before. Vision arose in me, knowledge arose in me, intuition arose in me, wisdom arose in me, light arose in me. 17. This is called the true excellence, conforming with the Arya quality of knowledge. This recalls the qualities of the new Omicron new, of the Olympian mind, a mind that, according to the most ancient Aryo-Hellenic tradition, is strictly related to being, and that is manifested in knowledge by seeing. The new Omicron new is proof against deception, is firm and tranquil as a mirror. It discovers everything without seeking, or rather, everything discovers itself in it, whereas the Titanic spirit is restless, inventive, and always in search of something cunning and curious. 8. Vision conceived as 14 Dig. Ha. 1.T.28, 37. 15 March 26. 16 E.G. March K5. 17 Samyukta 36.24, 12.10. I8. C.F. Kireni, La Religione Antica pp. 104, 167. 41. Transparency is the Buddhist ideal, as one sees through limpid water, the sand, the gravel, and the color of the pebbles, simply by reason of its transparency. So one who seeks the path of liberation must have just such a limpid mind. 19. The image that illustrates the manner in which an ascetic apprehends the four truths of the Arya is this: if at the edge of an alpine lake of clear, transparent and pure water there were to stand a man, with keen sight looking at the shells and shellfish, the gravel and the sand and the fish, watching how they swim and how they rest, this thought would come to him: this alpine lake is clear, transparent, and pure. I see the shells and shellfish, the gravel, the sand and the fish, how they swim and rest. In this same manner an ascetic apprehends, in conformity with truth, the supreme object of the doctrine. The formula, in conformity with truth, or with reality, Yat Bhutam, is a recurrent theme in the texts, like the attributes, eye of the world, or become eye, or become knowledge, of the awakened ones. This is naturally an achievement only if followed a gradual process. As an ocean deepens gradually, declines gradually, shelves gradually without sudden precipices, so in this law and discipline there is a gradual training, a gradual action, a gradual unfolding, and no sudden apprehend. Scion of supreme knowledge. 21 Again, one cannot, I say, attain supreme knowledge all at once, only by a gradual training, a gradual action, a gradual unfolding, does one attain perfect knowledge. In what manner? A man comes, moved by confidence, having come, he joins, the order of the arya, having joined he listens. Listening, he receives the doctrine, having received the doctrine, he remembers it, he examines the sense of the things remembered, from examining the sense, the things are approved of, having approved, desire is born, he ponders, pondering, he eagerly trains himself, and eagerly training himself, he mentally realizes the highest truth itself and, penetrating it by means of wisdom, he sees. 22 These are the milestones of the development. It is hardly worth saying that the placing of confidence at the beginning of the series does not signify a falling back into belief. In the first place, the texts always considered that confidence is prompted by the inspiring stature and the example of a master. 23 In the second place, as we can see clearly from the development of the series, it is a matter of a provisional admission only. The real adherence comes when, with examination and practice, the faculty of direct apprehension, of intellectual intuition, absolutely independent of its antecedents, has become possible. Therefore it is said, he who cannot strenuously train himself, cannot achieve truth, through strenuous training, and a ascetic achieves truth. There were 9. Angat, T.5, Makprimev, 64. 20 March, 39. 2T. Angat. 8.19. 22 March, 70. 23 Ibid, 95. 42 For strenuous training is the most important thing for the achieving of truth. 24. Naturally, there is here an implicit assumption, which we shall discuss before long in detail, an assumption, that is to say, that the men to whom the doctrine was directed were not entirely in the state of brute beasts, that they recognized, not as an intellectual opinion, but through a natural and innate sense, the existence of a reality superior to that of the senses. For the common man, one who thinks in his heart, there is no giving, no offering, no alms, there is no result of good and bad actions, there is no this world, there is no other world, there is no spiritual rebirth, there are not in the world ascetics or Brahmans who are perfect and fulfilled and who, having with their own understanding, comprehended, and realized this world and the other world, make known their knowledge. For such the doctrine was not considered to have been expounded, since they lack the elementary quality of confidence that defines the noble son, and that is the first member of the series we have mentioned. Such men, according to an APT textual illustration, are as arrows shot by night. As for the preeminence accorded, in a pragmatic and anti-intellectualistic spirit, to action in the doctrine of awakening, we quote another bud hist simile. A man struck by a poisoned arrow, for whom his friends and companions wish to fetch a surgeon, refuses to have the arrow extracted before learning who struck him, what his name might he, who his people are, what his appearance, if his bow was great or small, of what wood it was made, with what it was strung, and so on. This man would not succeed in learning enough to satisfy him before he died. Just so, says the text too. 6. Would a man behave who followed the sublime one only on the condition that the latter gave him answers to various speculative problems, telling him if the world was eternal or not, if body and the life principle are distinct or not, what happens to the accomplished one after death, and so on. None of this, says the Buddha, has been explained by me. And why has it not been explained by me? Because this is not salutary, it is not truly ascetic, it does not lead to disgust, it does not lead to detachment, it does not lead to dispassion, it does not lead to calmness, it does not lead to contemplation, it does not lead to awakening, it does not lead to extinction. Therefore has this not been explained by me. 27. In the opposing theories regarding the world and regarding man, characteristically reminiscent of the Kantian antinomies, either one opposite or the other might be true. One thing is certain, however, the state in which man actually finds himself, and the possibility of his training himself, during his lifetime, to achieve the destruction of this state. 28. 24 Ibid. 25 Dhammapada. 304. 26 March. 63. 27 Diga. 9.28, March. 63. 28 63. 43 5. The flame, and samsaric consciousness. In order to understand the Buddhist teaching we must start from the idea that to the man it had in mind the Tima Brahman, the immortal and immutable, identical with the supreme essence of the universe, would not he a concept, conforming to reality, but based, that is to say, on the actual evidence of experience, but rather that it would be only a speculation, a creation of philosophy or theology. The doctrine of awakening aims at being entirely realistic. From the realistic point of view, the immediate evidence for such a man is what we have already called samsaric consciousness. Buddhism proceeds to analyze this consciousness and to determine the truth corresponding to it, summarized in the theory of universal impermanence and insubstantiality, anat. In previous speculation, the first term of the binomial Tima samsara that is, the immutable, transcendent I, and the current of becoming, stood in the foreground. In the teaching that serves as the point of departure for the Buddhist ascesis, emphasis is placed, instead almost exclusively on the second term, samsara, and the consciousness associated with it. This second term, however, is considered in all those aspects of contingency, relativity, and irrationality that can only proceed from a comparison with the metaphysical reality already directly intuited. This reality itself therefore remains tacitly presupposed, even if, for practical reasons, it is not mentioned in the argument. The world of becoming is thus, in a manner of speaking, the truth Buddhism uses. From the start, in the becoming nothing remains identical, there is nothing substantial, and nothing permanent. T is the becoming of experience itself, consuming itself in its own momentary content. Ceaseless and limitless, it is also conceived as nothing more than a succession of states that give place one to another according to an impersonal law, as in an eternal circle. We can here see an exact parallel of the 44 Hellenic concept of the cycle of generation, kappa kappa lambda omicron tau eta gamma epsilon nu sigma epsilon omega, and the wheel of necessity, epsilon psi, alpha rho sin eta. The Buddhist term designating a particular reality or individual life or phenomenon is khandha or santna. Khandha literally means a group, a heap, to be understood as a bundle or aggregation, and santna means current. In the flux of becoming there form vortices or currents of psychophysical elements and of allied states, called dhamma, which persist as long as the conditions and the force remain that have made them come together and pile up. After this they dissolve and, in their becoming, samsara, they form similar conglomerations elsewhere, no less contingent than the preceding ones. Thus it is said, all the elements of existence are trans. Ita, all things are without individuality, or substance, sabbe dhamma anat, t. The law of samsaric consciousness is expressed by this formula, sannam idam akrena va ataniena vievit macronti, void of I, or of anything that resembles I, void of substance. Another expression, everything is compounded. Sankata, compounded, being the equivalent here of conditioned. 2. In samsara, there are only conditioned states of existence and consciousness. This view is valid both for external and internal experience. We must emphasize that the Dhamma, the primary elements of existence, are considered by Buddhism, and particularly its later forms, to be simple contents of consciousness, and not abstract, explanatory principles created by thought, as, for example, the atoms of the ancient schools of physics. Thus we shall find that the doctrine of anat, of insubstantiality, when applied to external experience will tend more and more toward pure empiricism. As the external world directly appears, so it is. We should not say, this object has this form, this color, this taste, etc., but, this object is this form, this color, this taste, etc. There is nothing behind sensible evidence to which it must be referred. As we would say in modern terms, there only exists and is real the continuum of lived experience. The same point of view is adopted with coherence, we might even say, with surgical directness, toward internal and personal experience, as the legitimacy of speaking, in conformity with reality, of a permanent substance behind individual phenomena, and even behind all nature, as the Brahmanical theory had it, is contested by Buddhism, so it challenges the idea of a substantial, immortal, and unchangeable principle of the person, such as the evit macrontium evit macron of the Upanishads. Even the person, Sakya is khandha and santna, an aggregate and a current of elements and of impermanent, compounded, and conditioned states. It is also sankata. It's I Dhammapta, 277, 279. 2 Dhammasangani, IS. 3 CFT Stravatsky. The Central Conception of Buddhism, London 1923, pp. 26-27. 45 Unity and reality are purely nominal, at the most, functional. If is said, as the word vegan is used when the various parts of a vegan are found together, so when the various elements making up human individuality are present, we speak of a person. As the joining together of the various parts makes up the concept of a vegan, so the aggregation or series of states gives name to a living being. The vegan is a functional unity of elements, not a substance, so with the person and the mind, in the same way. The words, living being, and I, are only a way of speaking of the fivefold stem of attachment, 5 when the conditions that have determined the combination of elements and states in that stem are no longer effective, the person as such, that is, as the particular person, dissolves. But even while he endures, the person is not a being, but a flowing, a current. Santna, or rather a section of a current, since santna is thought of as something that is neither started by birth nor interrupted by death. The positive basis of this view, not very encouraging for our everyday spiritualists, is that the only consciousness of which the overwhelming majority of modern men can speak truthfully, via with macron th with macron bhutam, is become, and formed. Consciousness. Consciousness determined and conditioned by content, which are, however, impermanent. Consciousness and perception are inseparable. These two things are joined, not separate. And it is impossible to dissociate them so as to differentiate between them, since of what one has a perception of that one is conscious and that of which one is conscious, of that one has a perception. 7. As it is meaningless to talk of fire in general, since a fire is only of logs, dung, faggots, or grass, and so on, so we cannot talk of consciousness in general, but only of a consciousness that is visual, or oral, or olfactive, or gustative, or tactile, or mental, according to the case in question. Through the eye, the object and visual consciousness, sight originates, so for hearing, so for smelling, taste, and touch, and so, through the mind and mental states, thought originates. These sensory states, then, derive their origins from other causes and can claim no substantial beginning. 9. It is in relation to body that the idea I am arises, and not otherwise. And similarly with feeling, perception, the formations, and consciousness, in relation to such causes the idea I am arises, and not otherwise, but these causes are, however, impermanent. 10. Looking at things in this manner, it. 4. Milinda Panha, 28. 5. Visuddhimagga, 8. Other notion of current appears as early as Diga, 3.105, and Samyukt, 3.143. This current is like a phantasmagoria void of substance, beyond it the ascetic, going as on, whose head is on fire, seeks, Rhe unshakable espade. 7. March 43. 8. Ibid. 38. 9. Milinda Panks 54, 57. 10. Samyukta, 22.83. 46. Becomes quite evident that the idea of an A with macron TMA with macron, of a substantial unconditioned, I, cannot he accepted. Consciousness is thus void of 1, since consciousness always arises in the presence of any sensory or psychic content. More generally, the real I, experienced by everyone, not the theoretical one, of the philosophers, is conditioned by name and form. This expression, taken by Buddhism from the Vedic tradition, designates the psychophysical individual, that part of this aggregate, which is gross and material. It is said, is form, that part which is subtle and mental is name, and between the one and the other there is an interdependent relationship. Bound to name and form, the soul follows its fate, it changes, and for this reason, as we shall see, anguish and trepidation belong to the deepest stratum of every human and, more generally, some read life. 13. Finally, individual consciousness and name and form condition each other. One cannot stand without the other, as, according to a textual simile, two planks cannot stand without one leaning against the other. This is the same as saying that person is considered as a functional whole to which the becoming is not accidental but is his very substance. One state ends and another begins, and the succession is such that it is almost possible to say that nothing precedes and nothing follows. 14. All this can be considered as a general introduction to the theory of the four truths of the Arya, Tri-Arya Sakni, and of conditioned genesis, Patika Samukta. The view of insubstantiality, as already discussed, does not go beyond a phenomenalistic consideration of the inward and outward world. To go further, we must adopt a different point of view in order to discover, in terms of direct experience, the deeper meaning and the law of this flowing, of this succession of states. The first two truths of the Arya, corresponding to the terms dukkha and tang, then appear. Already at this point of our investigations we have to undertake the task of separating the core of the Buddhist teaching from its accessory elements and from its popular adaptations, and, furthermore, we have to contend with a terminology whose precise significance is extremely difficult to formulate in Western languages, particularly as the meaning of a term often changes even in the course of a single text, while the terms of modern Western languages have strictly precise meanings, due to their being based for the most part on verbal and conceptual abstractions. The terms of Indo-Aryan languages have, on the other hand, essentially 11 Ibid, 35.193, 12 Milinda Panha, 49, 13 Ibid, 49, cf. Visuddhimagga, 17, W, 184. The same idea is expressed with the following simile: if the oil and the wick or a light are impermanent, then it cannot be thought that the light is permanent or eternal. March, 146. 14 Milinda Panha, 40 to 41. 47 Variable meanings, as they have to express the richness of direct experience. The term dukkha is frequently translated as pain, whence the stereotyped notion that the essence of Buddhist teaching is simply that the world is pain. But this is the most popular and, we might almost say, profane interpretation of the Buddhist doctrine. It is quite true that dukkha in the texts also refers to such things as growing old, being ill, undergoing what one wishes to avoid and being deprived of what one desires, and so on, all of which can in general be considered as pain or suffering. Yet, for example, the idea that birth itself is dukkha should make us pause, and particularly as the same term refers to non-human, celestial, or divine. States of consciousness that certainly cannot be considered as subject to pain in the ordinary sense of the word. The deeper, doctrinal, and non-popular significance of the term dukkha is a state of agitation, of restlessness, or of commotion, rather than suffering. We can describe it as the lived counterpart of what is expressed in the theory of universal impermanence and insubstantiality, of anicca, and of anat. And it is for this reason that, in the texts, dukkha, anicca, and anat, when they do not actually appear as synonyms, 16 are always found in close relationship. This interpretation is confirmed if we consider dukkha in the light of its opposite, that is, of the states of liberation. Dukkha now appears as the antithesis of unshakable calm, which is superior not only to pain, but also to pleasure, as the opposite of the incomparable safety, the state in which there is no more restless wandering, no more coming and going, and where fear and anguish are destroyed. In order really to understand the implications of dukkha, the first truth of the Arya, and therefore to grasp the deepest significance of samsaric existence, we must associate the notion of anguish with that of commotion and agitation. The Buddha saw in the world a race which trembles, men trembling, attached to their persons, like fish in a stream that is almost dry. 17. This world is fallen into agitation, is the thought that came to him while he was still striving to achieve illumination. In truth, this world has been overcome by agitation. We are born, we die, we pass away. From one state, we arise in another. And from this sorrow, from this decay and death, no one knows the escape. Therefore it is a question of something far deeper and larger than anything the usual notion of pain can designate. We now come to the second truth of the Arya, which deals with samudaya, that is, with origin. From what does this experience of ours, which manifests itself as dukkha, as agitation, as anguished becoming, originate? From where does it draw nourishment? 15 Syaschavatsky, Central Conception. p. 48. 16 Chansing, Mystica del Buddhismo. p. 95. 17 Satyanipta, 4.2.5, 6. 18 Samyukta 12.t0. 19 Vika. 14th February 2018. 48 And what maintains it? The answer is tan, skt, trsna, that is to say, craving or thirst. Thirst for life forever renewing itself, which, when it is joined to the pleasure of satisfaction and gratifies itself here and there, is thirst for sensual pleasure, thirst for existence, thirst for becoming. This is the central force of samsaric existence. This is the principle that determines the anatta, that is, the non-necessity of anything and any life whatsoever, and that endows all life with alteration and death. Thirst, craving, burning, according to the Buddhist teaching, stand not only at the root of all states of mind, but also of experience in general, of the forms of feeling, perception, and observation that are most nearly considered to be neutral and mechanical. Thus we get the suggestive symbolism of the burning world. The whole world is in flames, the whole world is consumed by fire, the whole world trembles. 20 All is in flames. And what is the all that is in flames? The eye is burning, what is visible is burning, consciousness of the visible is burning, contact of the eye with what is visible is burning, the feeling, be it pleasure or pain, or neither pain nor pleasure, which arises from the contact with what is visible is burning, and with what is it burning? With the fire of desire, with the fire of aversion, with the fire of delusion, and the same theme is repeated separately for what is heard, for what is tasted, touched, and smelled, and for what is thought. 21 And again there is the same theme for the pankakang, the fivefold stem of the personality, materiality, feeling, perception, the formations, consciousness. 22 This flame burns not only in desire, aversion, and delusion, but also in birth and death, in decay, in every kind of pain and suffering. Such is the second truth of the Arya, the truth about origin. To understand it we must go beyond the most superficial plane of consciousness, since although everyone will probably concede that desire is the root of a large number of human actions, practically none will ever understand intuitively that it is the substance of his own bodily form, the root of his very individuality, the base of his every experience, even of that of a color or a sound,